Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is James Anderson, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of Zion National Park, Utah. 3 weeks ago, though the memories feel both distant and immediate, like a fever dream that refuses to fade. Sarah had been planning this trip for months. She was the kind of person who color-coded her hiking gear and memorized topographical maps for fun. Mike and I had been friends since college, bonding over late-night philosophy discussions and a shared love of craft beer. When Sarah suggested we tackle the more remote sections of the park, areas where permits were required and most tourists never ventured, we jumped at the chance. We all needed a break from our corporate lives in Denver, and the promise of 3 days in Utah's Red Rock wilderness seemed like the perfect escape. The drive down had been filled with the usual banter. Mike, ever the comedian, had us laughing at his terrible impressions of our boss while Sarah navigated with military precision. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have friends like these. People who would drop everything for an adventure, who knew me well enough to sense when I needed to get away from the suffocating routine of my accounting job. We'd secured permits for a backcountry route that would take us through some of the narrower slot canyons, areas where the sandstone walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, sometimes barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Sarah had assured us it would be incredible and safe, provided we watched the weather for flash flood potential. The first day started perfectly. We parked at the trailhead just as the sun was cresting the eastern cliffs, painting the red rock in shades of gold and amber. The air was crisp with that high desert clarity that makes every detail sharp and clean. Mike shouldered his pack with a dramatic grunt, claiming Sarah had somehow made his gear heavier overnight. Sarah rolled her eyes and consulted her GPS one more time, even though she had the route memorized. 12 miles to our first campsite, she announced. The real narrow sections start about 6 miles in. The initial trail was well-maintained, winding through stands of juniper and pinon pine. We passed a few day hikers heading out early, exchanging pleasant nods and the universal, beautiful morning comments that strangers share in wild places. But as we descended into the first canyon system, the crowds disappeared entirely. The only sounds were our boots crunching on sand and gravel, the whisper of wind through the rock formations, and the distant call of a raven somewhere high above. It was Mike who first noticed something odd. "Hey, check this out," he called, stopping beside a large boulder. Carved into the sandstone were symbols I didn't recognize, not the usual graffiti or modern petroglyphs you sometimes found in accessible areas. These looked older, more deliberate. The lines were deep and weathered, forming angular patterns that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them from different angles. Sarah joined us, pulling out her phone to take pictures. "Probably ancestral Puebloan," she said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty, though these look different from the usual petroglyphs in this area. "Different how?" I asked. She frowned, studying the symbols more closely. "The style is, I don't know, more aggressive, I guess. Most rock art around here depicts animals, hunting scenes, spiritual symbols. These look almost like warnings." Mike laughed. "Come on, Sarah. You're not going to start getting spooked by some old drawings, are you?" But I noticed Sarah continued to stare at the symbols for a long moment before shouldering her pack. Something about her expression made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on what. The canyon walls began to close in as we continued deeper. What had started as a broad valley gradually narrowed until we were walking single file through passages barely wide enough for our packs. The light took on a different quality here, filtered and refracted by the curved sandstone walls until everything seemed to glow with an inner warmth. It was beautiful, but also claustrophobic in a way I hadn't expected. "This is incredible," Mike said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. But even as he spoke, I noticed he kept looking over his shoulder, as if he felt something following us. That's when Sarah's GPS started acting up. "That's weird," she muttered, stopping to examine the device. "It's showing us about half a mile off from where we should be." "Could be the canyon walls interfering with the signal," I suggested, though even as I said it, something felt wrong. We hadn't gone that deep yet. The GPS should still be working fine. Sarah pulled out her backup, a paper map and compass, but when she tried to take a bearing, the compass needle spun wildly before settling on what was clearly the wrong direction. She tapped the glass, tested it against her watch, checked for nearby metal objects. Nothing helped. "Equipment failure?" Mike asked, but his joking tone had evaporated. "Both at the same time?" Sarah shook her head. "That's unlikely." We decided to continue following the canyon since there was really only one way to go. The walls towered above us now, maybe 200 feet of striated red and orange stone that blocked out most of the sky. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and sounds seemed muffled and strange. Our voices didn't echo properly. Sometimes they seemed swallowed entirely. Other times they bounced back with an odd delay that made it sound like someone else was speaking. It was around midday when we found the first backpack. It was sitting upright against the canyon wall as if someone had just set it down for a rest. The fabric was modern, expensive, the kind of technical gear serious hikers used. But it was covered in a fine layer of dust that suggested it had been there for weeks, maybe months. "Should we check for ID?" Mike asked. Sarah was already unzipping the main compartment. Inside were the usual supplies: water bottles, energy bars, a sleeping bag, spare clothes. Everything looked normal except for one detail that made my skin crawl. Every single piece of clothing had been turned inside out. "Maybe they repacked in a hurry," I suggested, but even I didn't believe it. "All of it." Sarah held up a jacket, examining the deliberately reversed seams. "Look at this. This was done carefully, methodically." At the bottom of the pack was a wallet. The driver's license belonged to someone named David Chen, age 34, from Salt Lake City. The photo showed a pleasant-looking man with dark hair and an easy smile. According to the timestamp on some receipts, he'd been in the area about 6 weeks ago. "We should report this," Sarah said, taking photos of the ID. "No cell signal down here," Mike pointed out. "We'll have to wait until we get back to the trailhead." But something about the abandoned pack bothered me deeply. Not just the inside-out clothes, but the way it had been positioned. It faced back the way we'd come, as if its owner had been watching the trail, waiting for something. We continued deeper into the canyon system. The walls continued to narrow and twist, creating sections where we had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The claustrophobic feeling was becoming overwhelming. Hundreds of feet of rock pressed in from both sides, the strip of sky above growing thinner and thinner. The very air seemed heavier here, tinged with a metallic taste that made my mouth dry. It was in one of these narrow sections that we heard the first sound. At first, I thought it was wind through the rock formations, a low, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from the stone itself. But as we stopped to listen, the pattern became too regular, too deliberate. It was definitely breathing, but deeper and slower than human lungs could produce. "Do you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered. We all heard it. The breathing seemed to move along the canyon walls above us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always just out of sight. Mike tried to laugh it off, suggesting it was just acoustic tricks in the narrow space, but his voice was tight with a fear he couldn't quite hide. The breathing followed us for the next hour, fading in and out like a tide. Sometimes it seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if we were surrounded by invisible presence. The sound made my skin crawl and my chest tight with panic. The narrow walls that had seemed beautiful that morning now felt like a trap. When we finally emerged into a wider area, a circular chamber where several canyons intersected, the breathing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. "Let's set up camp here," Sarah suggested, and we all agreed eagerly. The chamber was maybe 50 feet across, with high walls that opened to a circle of sky above. It felt relatively safe after the claustrophobic passages, though something about the perfect circular shape nagged at me. It looked almost artificial, as if it had been carved rather than naturally formed. We made camp quickly and efficiently, working with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this many times before. But I noticed we were all more careful than usual, double-checking our gear, testing our equipment. The abandoned backpack and the strange breathing sounds had affected us all, though none of us wanted to admit it. As the sun set, the circular chamber filled with an odd twilight. The walls seemed to glow with residual heat, but the air grew cold quickly. We built our fire in the center of the space, and I was grateful for the warm, normal light it provided. "Anyone else think this place is weird?" Mike asked as we sat around the flames. "Define weird," Sarah replied, but her tone suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "I don't know. The shape of this place, the way sounds carry, that breathing earlier." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the darkening sky. "And did you notice? No wildlife? We haven't seen a single animal all day. No birds, no lizards, nothing." He was right. The canyon had been completely devoid of life except for us. Even the insects were absent. No buzz of flies, no chirping crickets as evening fell. The silence was unnatural and unsettling. "Maybe it's seasonal," I suggested weakly. But Sarah was shaking her head. "This area should be full of life. Desert bighorn sheep, rock squirrels, ringtails, all kinds of birds. The ecosystem here is usually really diverse." We sat in uncomfortable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The fire seemed smaller than it should be, its light not reaching as far as it normally would. Beyond the circle of flickering warmth, the darkness felt absolute and watching. It was Mike who suggested we tell ghost stories, trying to lighten the mood with the kind of campfire tradition that usually brought friends together. But when he started describing some urban legend he'd heard about Utah's canyon country, his voice took on an odd quality in the strange acoustics of the circular chamber. The story seemed to echo back at us, the words distorted and ominous. He was describing something about ancient spirits trapped in the rock when the fire went out. Not gradually, it just died, as if someone had thrown a switch. One moment we were sitting in warm, flickering light. The next, we were plunged into absolute darkness. The kind of darkness that exists deep underground, where no photon of light has ever penetrated. "What the hell?" Mike's voice came from somewhere to my left, tight with alarm. I heard Sarah fumbling with her flashlight, the metallic clicking of the switch. But no light came. She tried several times, then I heard her pulling out backup lights from her pack. None of them worked. My own flashlight was dead too, though I'd checked the batteries that morning. We sat in the impenetrable darkness, trying to process what was happening. The silence was complete. Even the usual night sounds of the desert were absent. Then we heard the breathing again. It was closer this time, definitely inside the chamber with us. The deep, rhythmic inhalations seemed to circle us, moving around the perimeter of our camp. But it wasn't quite right. The timing was off, too slow and too deliberate, like something trying to mimic human breathing without quite understanding how it worked. "Stay close together," Sarah whispered, but her voice seemed to come from much farther away than it should have. I reached out in the direction I'd last seen her, but my hand found only empty air. The darkness was so complete it felt physical, pressing against my face like a heavy curtain. "Sarah? Mike?" I called, but my voice seemed muffled and strange. No answer. The breathing continued its slow circuit around me, and I realized with growing horror that I was alone in the dark. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen with terror. Time seemed distorted in the absolute darkness. It could have been minutes or hours. The breathing never stopped, never came closer, but never went away either. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers in a language I didn't recognize, words that seemed to come from the stone walls themselves. When light finally returned, it came gradually, like a sunrise that took place in seconds rather than hours. The fire was burning normally again, as if it had never gone out. Sarah and Mike were sitting exactly where they'd been before, staring at the flames with expressions of confusion and fear. "Did that really happen?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The fire went out," Sarah confirmed. "All our lights failed. How long were we—" She looked at her watch and frowned. "According to this, it's been 6 hours. But that's impossible. It felt like maybe 20 minutes. I checked my own watch and saw the same thing. Somehow, we'd lost most of the night without any memory of it. The fire showed no signs of having burned for hours. There should have been a much larger pile of ash. The wood should have been mostly consumed. Instead, it looked exactly as it had when darkness fell." "We should leave," I said. "First light, we pack up and get out of here." But Mike was shaking his head. "We're already a day into the backcountry. It would take just as long to go back as to continue forward." "Something's wrong with this place," I insisted. "The GPS failure, the compass problems, that abandoned pack, the breathing sounds, now this. We need to leave." "It's just equipment malfunctions and acoustic tricks," Mike argued, but his voice lacked conviction. "We're letting our imaginations run away with us." Sarah was studying her map by firelight, her expression troubled. "Actually, there might be another problem. I'm not entirely sure where we are anymore. Without the GPS or compass, and after losing those hours, I think we might have taken a wrong turn somewhere." The rest of the night passed without incident, but none of us slept well. I found myself staring up at the circle of stars above, trying to shake the feeling that something was staring back down at me. The breathing sounds had stopped when the light returned, but I kept thinking I could hear whispers just at the edge of hearing, words in that same unknown language coming from the canyon walls. Morning couldn't come fast enough. We broke camp quickly and efficiently, all of us eager to put the strange circular chamber behind us. Sarah had decided on a route based on her best guess of our location, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Without reliable navigation tools, we were essentially guessing. The canyon leading out of the chamber was different from the one we'd entered through, narrower and more twisted, with an odd reddish light that seemed to come from the stone itself rather than the sky above. The walls were covered in more of those strange symbols we'd seen earlier, but these were different, more complex, more urgent-looking. "Are these the same petroglyphs?" Mike asked, running his fingers over the carved lines. "No," Sarah said definitively. "These are newer. Look at the tool marks. They're much sharper than anything that old should be." She was right. The symbols looked like they'd been carved recently, maybe within the last few years. But that raised even more questions. Who would come this far into the backcountry just to carve cryptic warnings into canyon walls? Because that's what they felt like. Warnings. The angular pattern seemed to depict something emerging from cracks in the earth, something with too many angles and shapes that hurt to look at directly. Other symbols showed stick figures running, always away from the twisted forms. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested again, but Mike was already heading deeper into the canyon. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. "It's just old art. People have been carving things in these rocks for thousands of years." But something about his voice sounded different, flatter, less animated than usual. When I looked at Sarah, I saw my own concern reflected in her eyes. The canyon continued to narrow as we progressed until we were again moving single file through passages barely wide enough for our packs. But this time, the claustrophobic feeling was worse. The walls seemed to press in with malevolent intent, and the weird reddish light made everything look like it was covered in blood. It was in one of these narrow sections that Mike disappeared. I was leading, Sarah was in the middle, and Mike was bringing up the rear. The passage curved sharply to the left, and when I emerged into a slightly wider area, I waited for the others to catch up. Sarah squeezed through the gap a moment later, breathing hard from the exertion. "Where's Mike?" I asked. Sarah looked back at the narrow opening. "He was right behind me." "Mike!" she called. No answer. The canyon walls swallowed her voice without an echo. "Mike!" I shouted, my voice cracking with sudden panic. Still nothing. I squeezed back through the narrow gap, Sarah right behind me, calling Mike's name. But the passage behind us was empty. Impossibly, completely empty. "He was just here," Sarah said, her voice rising with hysteria. "He was literally right behind me. People don't just vanish." We spent the next hour searching, calling his name until our voices were raw. We backtracked through the narrow passages, checked every side canyon and crevice we could find. But Mike was gone as completely as if he'd never existed. "This is impossible," Sarah kept repeating. "People don't just disappear. He has to be somewhere." But as the hours passed and our searches grew more desperate, a horrible certainty began to settle over me. Whatever was wrong with this place, whatever force had caused our equipment failures and the lost time, it had taken Mike. We were still searching when we heard his voice. "Hey guys, over here." The call came from somewhere ahead of us, from the direction we'd originally been traveling. Sarah and I looked at each other with a mixture of relief and confusion. "Mike," Sarah shouted back. "Where were you?" "I got turned around in those narrow passages," his voice called back. "Found a side canyon that looked like the main route. I'm up ahead. Keep following the main canyon." We hurried forward, following his voice through another series of narrow passages. But something nagged at me about the sound of his voice. It was definitely Mike, but something was subtly wrong with the tone, the cadence. Like someone doing a very good impression but missing some crucial detail. We found him sitting on a boulder in another circular chamber, similar to the one where we'd camped but smaller. He waved when he saw us, his familiar grin lighting up his face. "Thank God," Sarah said, rushing forward to hug him. "We thought you'd disappeared. How did you get ahead of us?" "Like I said, I took what I thought was the main route," Mike replied. "Guess I was faster than I thought." But as he spoke, I noticed he wasn't looking directly at us. His gaze seemed to focus on points slightly to the left or right of our faces, as if he was having trouble tracking our movements. "Are you okay?" I asked. "You seem different." Mike's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just tired, and a little freaked out by getting lost. You know how I get in tight spaces." Except Mike had never been claustrophobic. In all the years I'd known him, he'd never shown any fear of confined spaces. Sarah gave me a look that suggested she'd noticed the same thing. "We should get moving," she said carefully. "Try to make up for lost time." "Absolutely," Mike agreed, but he made no move to get up from the boulder. "Just need to rest for a few more minutes." That's when I noticed his backpack. It was sitting beside him, positioned exactly like the abandoned pack we'd found earlier. Upright, facing back the way we'd come, as if watching the trail. And something about the way the straps were arranged, the angle of the buckles, looked wrong. "Mike," I said slowly, "turn around." "What?" His head tilted at an unnatural angle, like a bird studying something interesting. "Just turn around, look behind you." For a moment he didn't move. Then, very slowly, his head began to rotate. But it kept rotating, turning much farther than any human neck should be able to turn, until he was looking directly backward while his body remained facing forward. Sarah screamed. The thing that looked like Mike smiled with his face, but the expression was all wrong. Too wide, with too many teeth that were suddenly sharp and pointed and far too numerous for any human mouth. "You found me," it said in Mike's voice, but the words seemed to come from somewhere behind its throat, as if something else was speaking through Mike's body like a puppet. I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran. Behind us, I could hear the Mike thing laughing, a sound like breaking glass and grinding stone. But worse than the laughter was the sound of movement. Not footsteps, but something sliding and scraping across the rock, pursuing us with inhuman speed. We plunged into the next narrow passage, Sarah sobbing as we squeezed through gaps barely wide enough for our bodies. The scraping sounds followed us, echoing from the walls in impossible ways that made it seem like the thing was coming from multiple directions at once. "What was that?" Sarah gasped as we emerged into another wider area. "Not Mike," I said, pulling her forward. "Whatever's in this place, it took Mike and put something else in his body." The canyon ahead split into 3 different passages. Without GPS or compass, We had no way of knowing which route would lead us out and which would take us deeper into the maze. "This way," Sarah said, choosing the leftmost passage seemingly at random. But as we entered the narrow canyon, I heard the mic thing calling after us, its voice echoing off the stone walls. "James! Sarah! Why are you running? It's just me." The voice was perfect now, exactly like Mike's, filled with hurt confusion that would have fooled anyone who hadn't seen that inhuman rotation of his head. If I hadn't known better, I would have turned back, convinced we'd made a terrible mistake. "Don't listen," I whispered to Sarah. "It's not him." The passage we'd chosen was even narrower than the previous ones, forcing us to remove our packs and push them ahead of us as we squeezed through sections barely wide enough for our bodies. The claustrophobic panic was overwhelming, made worse by the knowledge that something inhuman was pursuing us through these stone corridors. Behind us, the mic thing continued calling, its voice growing more distorted and angry as we failed to respond. "Sarah! James! You're going the wrong way. There's something dangerous ahead." Then, more chillingly, "I can smell your fear. I can taste it in the air." That definitely wasn't Mike's voice anymore. We pushed forward through the crushing narrow passage, our breathing harsh and panicked in the confined space. The rock walls scraped against our shoulders and backs, and more than once I felt the horrible certainty that we were going to get stuck, trapped in the stone while that thing caught up to us. But the passage finally opened into a larger canyon, and we stumbled out into blessed open space. This canyon was different from the others, wider, with higher walls and filled with an odd blue-green light that seemed to have no source. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing ahead. The canyon floor was littered with backpacks and camping gear, all arranged in the same unnatural way, upright, facing back toward the narrow passages, as if their owners had been sitting and watching when something terrible happened to them. There were dozens of them, maybe more, stretching out along the canyon floor like a grotesque trail markers. "How many people have come through here?" I asked, but Sarah was already moving forward, checking the gear for identification. Every pack told the same story. Hikers, backpackers, climbers who had disappeared over the years. Names and faces from missing person reports. People who had vanished without a trace in Utah's canyon country. All of them had ended up here, in this impossible blue-lit canyon that didn't appear on any map. "We have to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice tight with terror. "Whatever this place is, whatever that thing was, we have to." The scream cut her off. A sound of pure agony that echoed from somewhere ahead, bouncing off the canyon walls with multiplying intensity. It was Mike's voice, but not the Mike thing that had been chasing us. This was different, filled with pain and desperation and horrible awareness. That's really him, I realized. The real Mike. It's hurting him. Sarah grabbed my arm. "We can't help him. Whatever that thing is, whatever it's doing, we can't—" Another scream, weaker this time, followed by a voice that was definitely not Mike calling out in that strange, ancient language we'd heard before. The words seemed to make the blue light flicker and pulse, as if the very air was responding to the sounds. "It's wearing him," I said, the horrible understanding finally clicking into place. "Like a suit. It took his body, and it's wearing it, but he's still conscious inside, still aware of what's happening." The thought was so horrifying that for a moment I couldn't breathe. The idea of being trapped inside your own body while something else controlled it, used it for purposes you couldn't imagine, was worse than any death I could conceive. But Sarah was right. There was nothing we could do. Whatever had taken Mike was far beyond our ability to fight or rescue him from. Our only chance was to find a way out of this nightmare canyon before it decided to add our gear to the collection scattered around us. We picked our way through the field of abandoned equipment, trying not to think about the dozens of people who had been captured, possessed, or worse in this place. The blue light grew brighter as we progressed, revealing more details I wished I couldn't see. The backpacks weren't just arranged facing the passages, they were arranged in patterns, geometric shapes that reminded me of the symbols carved into the canyon walls. Someone or something had been organizing them deliberately, creating designs that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them directly. "Don't look too closely at the patterns," Sarah warned. "I think they're meant to do something to your mind." She was right. The longer I stared at the arrangements, the more disoriented I became. The blue light seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, and I started hearing whispers in that unknown language, words that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly into my brain. We were halfway through the field of gear when we heard footsteps behind us. Not the scraping, sliding sounds the mic thing had made earlier. These were normal footsteps, the familiar rhythm of Mike's hiking boots on stone. When I turned around, he was standing at the mouth of the passage we'd emerged from, looking exactly like himself again. "There you are," he said, and his voice was perfect, warm with relief and affection. "I've been looking everywhere for you. What is this place?" For a moment, I almost believed it, almost convinced myself that we'd been wrong, that Mike had somehow escaped whatever had possessed him. But Sarah grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Look at his feet," she whispered. I looked down and saw that Mike was standing on top of one of the arranged backpacks, but the pack wasn't compressed or disturbed. It was as if he had no weight, no physical presence at all. "You're not Mike," I said. The thing wearing Mike's face smiled, and this time the expression was perfectly human. That somehow made it worse than the inhuman grin from before. "Of course I'm Mike," it said reasonably. "Who else would I be? You guys have been acting really strange since we left that circular chamber. Are you feeling okay?" Its voice was so exactly right, so filled with genuine concern, that for a moment I felt myself wavering. What if we were wrong? What if the stress and fear had made us paranoid, made us see threats where none existed? Then the thing took a step forward, and I saw that it cast no shadow in the blue light. "Stay back," Sarah said, raising her hiking pole like a weapon. The mic thing tilted its head, studying us with an expression of hurt confusion that was absolutely perfect. "Sarah, it's me. I don't understand why you're acting like this. Did something happen while I was gone?" "You rotated your head 180 degrees, I said. "People can't do that." "I did what?" The confusion in its voice sounded completely genuine. "I think you might be hallucinating. The stress, the altitude, maybe dehydration. You need to calm down and think clearly." It was so reasonable, so concerned, so exactly like Mike in every detail that I found myself taking a step toward it. Maybe we had been hallucinating. Maybe the fear and disorientation had made us see things that weren't there. "James, no," Sarah said urgently. "Look at the ground around it." I looked down and saw that the blue light was reacting to the creature's presence, swirling and pulsing in patterns that matched the arrangements of the backpacks. Where it stepped, the stone itself seemed to darken and corrupt, as if its very presence was poisonous to the natural world. "That's not Mike," Sarah said firmly. "Mike is dead. That thing killed him, and it's wearing his body like a costume." The creature's perfect mask of concern slipped for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something vast and hungry and utterly inhuman looking out through Mike's eyes. Then the mask was back in place, but the brief lapse was enough. "Run," I told Sarah. We sprinted through the field of backpacks, no longer caring about the patterns or the blue light's effects on our minds. Behind us, the thing began to laugh, not with Mike's voice anymore, but with a sound like wind through broken glass. The canyon ahead curved sharply to the right, and we followed it desperately, hoping it would lead to some kind of exit. But as we rounded the bend, my heart sank. We were back in the circular chamber where we'd made camp the night before. "That's impossible," Sarah gasped. "We've been traveling for hours. We should be miles from here." But there was our cold campfire, our tent stakes still in the ground where we'd pulled up the tent that morning. Somehow, despite all our travel through different canyons and passages, we'd ended up exactly where we started. It's a maze, I realized. The whole canyon system is designed to bring people back here. That's why there were so many missing hikers. They all ended up trapped in this loop. Behind us, we could hear the Mike thing approaching, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of humanity. Its footsteps had changed to that sliding, scraping sound, and it was making noises in that ancient language that seemed to make the very air vibrate with malevolent energy. "There has to be a way out," Sarah said, pulling out her map and compass. But the compass needle was spinning wildly again, and the map showed details that didn't match the canyon around us. That's when I noticed something we'd missed before. High up on the canyon wall, maybe 60 feet above us, was a narrow ledge that led to what looked like a crack in the stone. It was almost invisible from below, hidden in shadow, but there was definitely an opening there. "Can you climb?" I asked Sarah. She looked up at the sheer sandstone wall and swallowed hard. "Not without gear, and even with gear that's a really dangerous route." "More dangerous than staying here?" The Mike thing's voice echoed from the passage behind us, closer now. "James, Sarah, I can smell your terror. It tastes like copper and lightning." "I'll boost you up to that first handhold," I said, pointing to a small depression in the rock about 8 feet up. "From there, you might be able to find a route. What about you? I'll follow, but you need to go first, in case this doesn't work." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but the sounds from the passage were getting closer. She nodded and moved to the wall. I made a stirrup with my hands and boosted her up to the first handhold. From there, she found a series of tiny cracks and protrusions that allowed her to inch her way up the sheer face. It was terrifying to watch. One slip would mean a fatal fall, but she climbed with desperate determination. She was about 30 feet up when the Mike thing emerged into the circular chamber. It had stopped trying to look human. Mike's body had been stretched and distorted, elongated in ways that made it clear something else was wearing it like a poorly fitting costume. The face was still recognizably Mike's, but the features were wrong, positioned at slightly incorrect angles that made it hideously uncanny. "Look what you made me do to your friend," it said, holding up Mike's hands. The fingers had been extended, stretched into claws that were far too long for human bones. He screamed so beautifully when I reshaped him. I started climbing, finding handholds through pure desperation. Below me, the creature was doing something to Mike's legs, elongating them so it could reach higher up the wall. I could hear bones snapping and reforming with wet, crunching sounds. "You can't escape," it called up to us, its voice now a harmony of Mike's tenor and something much deeper and more resonant. "This place belongs to me. Everyone who enters becomes part of me, eventually." Sarah had reached the ledge and was helping pull me up the last few feet. My hands were bloody from the sharp stone, my muscles screaming from the desperate climb, but I made it onto the narrow outcropping just as the creature below began scaling the wall with inhuman speed. The crack in the stone was barely wide enough for a person, but it definitely went through to the other side. I could feel air moving through it. Sarah squeezed in first, and I followed, just as the creature's elongated claws scraped against the ledge behind us. The crack was the worst kind of claustrophobic nightmare, barely wider than my shoulders, winding through solid rock for what felt like hundreds of feet. More than once I thought we were going to get stuck, trapped in the stone while that thing found another way around to catch us. But finally, after what felt like hours of desperate squeezing through the crushing passage, we emerged onto a different canyon entirely. This one was wider, filled with normal daylight instead of that eerie blue glow, and most importantly, I could see the sky clearly above us. "My GPS is working," Sarah said, checking her device with shaking hands. "We're about 3 miles from the trailhead. We can make it." We ran. Not the careful, measured pace of experienced hikers, but an all-out sprint driven by pure terror. Behind us, I could hear the creature howling with frustration, the sound echoing from the crack in the stone like the screams of the damned. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking area. Our car was still there, covered in dust, but untouched. I'd never been so happy to see anything in my life. It wasn't until we were driving away, putting miles between us and that nightmare canyon, that the full horror of what had happened really hit me. Mike was dead. Our friend, our companion for so many years, had been killed by something inhuman and ancient that wore his body like a suit of clothes. We reported him missing, of course, told the rangers about equipment failure and getting separated in the narrow passages. They mounted a search, but they never found any trace of him. How could they? The canyon where he died didn't exist on any map, couldn't be reached by any route we could describe. Sarah moved to a different state a week later. She couldn't handle staying in Colorado, couldn't bear the thought of the mountains and canyons that had been such a big part of our friendship. We talk sometimes, but never about what happened. The shared trauma bonds us, but it also makes it impossible to pretend things are normal. I still have nightmares about the blue light and the field of backpacks. Sometimes I dream that I'm back in that circular chamber, and I can hear Mike calling for help from somewhere far below, trapped in his own body while something else controls it. I wake up screaming more often than I care to admit, but the worst part is the doubt. In the quiet moments when I'm alone with my thoughts, I sometimes wonder if we really saw what we thought we saw. The human mind has a way of rationalizing even the most impossible experiences, and I catch myself looking for logical explanations. Equipment failure, hallucinations brought on by stress and dehydration, group hysteria, gas leaks from underground formations causing shared delusions. Maybe Mike really did just get lost and die of exposure somewhere in the maze of canyons. Maybe everything else was just our traumatized minds trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. But then I remember the feel of that thing's presence, the wrongness that radiated from it like heat from a fire. I remember the perfect imitation of Mike's voice and the horrible moment when his head rotated beyond any human capability. And I remember the sound of his real voice screaming in agony as something else took control of his body. 3 weeks have passed since we escaped that place, and I've been trying to return to normal life, going to work, paying bills, pretending that the world makes sense. But I can't shake the feeling that something followed us out. Small things mostly. Electronics malfunctioning around me, lights flickering when I enter a room, the sense of being watched when I'm alone. And sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed, I hear breathing that's too slow and too deep to be human. It's never close enough to be sure, never loud enough to be certain, but it's there, keeping the same rhythm I remember from that first night in the circular chamber. I've been researching Utah's canyon country, trying to find some record of other disappearances, other strange experiences. There are more missing person cases than I expected, hikers and backpackers who vanished without a trace in areas where people shouldn't be able to disappear. But what really disturbs me are the stories I've found on obscure forums and message boards, other people who claim to have encountered something in the remote canyons, something that takes people and uses their bodies for its own purposes. Most of the accounts are dismissed as hoaxes or delusions, but the details are remarkably consistent. Blue light that has no source, ancient symbols carved into rock walls, the sense of being trapped in a maze that leads nowhere, and always the thing that wears familiar faces but isn't quite right, isn't quite human. The Navajo have stories about skinwalkers, witches who can take the form of animals and humans. But this was something different, something older and more alien, something that treats human beings like tools to be used and discarded when they're no longer useful. I've been considering going back, not to that specific canyon. I could never find it again, and I'm not sure I'd want to, but to the general area, to look for more evidence, more proof that what we experienced was real. Sarah thinks I'm losing my mind. She might be right. The rational part of my brain keeps insisting that there has to be a logical explanation for everything we experienced. But the deeper part, the part that still wakes up in a cold sweat from dreams of blue light and inhuman laughter, knows better. Something is still out there in those canyons, something that has been there for longer than human civilization. It's patient and cunning and hungry, and it's been feeding on lost travelers for generations. Mike was just the latest victim in a pattern that stretches back decades, maybe centuries. And I have the horrible certainty that it's not finished yet. Because 3 nights ago, I woke up to find my front door standing wide open. I live alone, and I always lock up before bed, habits developed from years of city living. But the door was open, and there were no signs of forced entry. On my doorstep was a single hiking boot. Mike's hiking boot, with his initials written in permanent marker on the tongue, just like he always did with his gear. Inside the boot was a note, written in Mike's handwriting. "Thanks for the memories, James. I'll see you soon." I called the police, but what could I tell them? That my dead friend left me a note? That something inhuman is stalking me? They'd have me committed. So I'm writing this instead, getting the whole story down while I still remember it clearly, while I'm still capable of rational thought, because I have the growing certainty that whatever took Mike is coming for me next. The breathing sounds are getting closer each night. The electronic malfunctions are becoming more frequent and more severe. And sometimes, when I catch sight of my reflection in a mirror or window, I swear I see something else looking back at me with my own eyes. If something happens to me, if I disappear or die under mysterious circumstances, I want people to know the truth. Utah's canyon country is not safe. There are things hiding in the remote places, ancient things that view human beings as nothing more than meat puppets to be worn and discarded. Don't go hiking alone in the backcountry. Don't trust your equipment when it starts malfunctioning. And if someone you're with disappears and comes back acting strange, don't trust them no matter how perfectly they seem to be acting normal. Most importantly, if you find yourself in a circular chamber surrounded by high canyon walls, if you see blue light with no source, if you find a field of abandoned backpacks arranged in impossible patterns, run. Don't try to help anyone you think might be trapped there. Don't try to investigate or understand what's happening. Just run, and pray that you can find your way back to the world of normal, human things before something decides to try on your skin like a new coat. I'm going to mail this to Sarah tomorrow, with instructions to make it public if anything happens to me. Then I'm going to barricade my doors and wait. Because I can hear footsteps outside my house right now, the familiar sound of Mike's hiking boots on my front walkway. And he's whistling our old college fight song, perfectly in tune, just like he always used to do. But Mike is dead. Whatever is walking up to my front door, whatever is about to knock with Mike's knuckles and speak with Mike's voice, it's not my friend. It's just wearing him. The knocking has started now. Soft, polite, exactly the way Mike always knocked when he came to visit. And now I can hear his voice calling through the door. "James, it's me, buddy. Can you let me in? I've been walking for such a long time, and I'm really tired." God help me. Part of me wants to open the door. Part of me wants to believe that somehow Mike survived, that everything we saw was just a hallucination brought on by stress and fear. But I can see his shadow under the door, and it's moving wrong, shifting and writhing like it's being cast by something that can't quite remember how human shadows are supposed to behave. "James?" Mike's voice calls again, and now there's a note of hurt in it, the perfect imitation of a friend who doesn't understand why he's being ignored. "I know you're in there. Why won't you talk to me?" I'm not going to answer. I'm going to sit here in the dark and wait for dawn, and hope that whatever is wearing Mike's body gives up and goes away. But deep down, I know it won't give up. It's been patient for decades, maybe centuries. It can afford to wait a little longer. And eventually, I'm going to have to sleep. When I do, I think I'm going to dream of blue light and narrow canyons and the sound of something trying to learn how to be human by wearing the bodies of the people it kills. If you're reading this, then something happened to me. Remember what I've told you. Stay away from the remote canyons. Don't trust anyone who comes back from the wilderness acting strange. And if you ever hear breathing that's too slow and too deep to be human, don't go looking for the source. Some things are better left undiscovered. The knocking has stopped now, but I can still see that writhing shadow under the door. It's just waiting, perfectly patient, perfectly still, just like Mike used to wait when he was thinking about something important. Just like Mike, but not Mike at all. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the high Uinta wilderness of northeastern Utah, in a place that shouldn't exist on any map, though it does now, burned into my memory like a brand. I'd planned the solo backpacking trip as a way to clear my head after the divorce. 3 days, 2 nights, just me and my golden retriever Max in the pristine wilderness of the Uinta Mountains. I'd hiked these trails before with David, back when we still talked to each other instead of through lawyers. The familiarity should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like returning to a graveyard. The trailhead at Mirror Lake was crowded with Labor Day weekend campers, but I'd planned for that. My route would take me deep into the backcountry, following Shingle Creek to a remote valley I'd found on the topographic maps, a place called Whisper Basin, though the locals I'd asked claimed they'd never heard of it. The elderly man at the gear shop in Comas had looked at my map for a long time, his weathered finger tracing the dotted line that marked the trail. "Funny," he'd muttered. "Could have sworn that valley had a different name." Max bounded ahead as we left the parking area, his golden coat bright against the dark pine needles carpeting the trail. The September air carried the crisp bite of approaching autumn, and the aspens were just beginning their turn to gold. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. The weight of my pack settled into familiar grooves on my shoulders, and for the first time in months, I felt something approaching contentment. The trail climbed steadily through dense lodgepole pine forest, and by midday we'd left most of the day hikers behind. Max trotted beside me, tongue lolling, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting smells before returning to heel. He was a good dog, well trained, and his presence made the solitude feel comfortable rather than oppressive. The first strange thing happened around 2 p.m. I'd stopped to check my GPS and noticed the screen flickering, the little blue dot that marked my position jumping erratically across the map. I tapped the device, but the glitching worsened. The battery showed full, but the satellite signal kept cutting in and out. I switched to my backup compass and paper map, figuring it was just interference from the mountains. "Technology, right, Max?" I said, scratching behind his ears. He whined softly, looking up the trail ahead with his ears perked. Following his gaze, I saw nothing but more pine trees and granite outcroppings. By 4 p.m., we'd reached what my map labeled as Shingle Creek, though the waterway was little more than a trickle this late in the season. The trail should have followed the creek northeast toward Whisper Basin, but I couldn't find any blazes marking the way forward. The main trail continued north, but that would take me to a more populated area near Bald Mountain. I studied the map again, comparing it to the terrain around me. According to the contour lines, there should be a valley opening to the east, but all I could see was unbroken forest. Max sat beside me, panting slightly, and I noticed he kept looking over his shoulder the way we'd come. "What is it, boy?" I asked, but he just whined again. I decided to trust the map and struck out cross-country, following what I hoped was the correct drainage. The trees grew thicker as we climbed, and the undergrowth became more tangled. Several times I had to backtrack around deadfall or steep sections of granite. The sun angled lower, and I began to worry about finding a suitable campsite before dark. That's when we stumbled into Whisper Basin. The valley opened abruptly, hidden behind a screen of trees and rock that made it invisible from below. It was smaller than I'd expected from the map, perhaps a mile across with steep walls rising on 3 sides. A small lake sat in the center, its surface black and perfectly still. The silence was absolute. No wind, no bird calls, no buzzing insects. Even our footsteps on the rocky soil seemed muffled. Max stopped at the tree line and refused to go further. When I tugged his leash, he planted his feet and whimpered. "Come on, boy, it's just a lake." But I had to admit the place felt wrong. The silence was too complete, too heavy. And though I couldn't put my finger on why, something about the proportions of the valley seemed off, as if the walls were simultaneously too close and too far away. I found a relatively flat spot about 50 yards from the lakeshore and set up camp, Max staying close by my side. As I worked, I noticed other oddities. There was no vegetation around the lake itself, just bare soil that looked almost scorched. No animal tracks in the soft earth. No fish rising in the dark water. When I tried to light my camp stove for dinner, the flame burned pale blue instead of its usual orange. I adjusted the fuel mixture several times, but the color remained wrong. The food heated normally, but tasted flat and metallic. Max refused his kibble entirely, which was unlike him. As darkness fell, the oppressive silence deepened. I'd camped alone many times before, but this felt different, hostile. I found myself straining to hear something, anything that would indicate normal wilderness around us. But there was nothing, not even the sound of water lapping at the lake shore. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag early, with Max curled up beside me in the tent. Despite my exhaustion from the hike, sleep eluded me. Every time I began to drift off, I'd jerk awake with the sensation that someone was watching us. Max seemed to feel it too, his body tense against mine, ears constantly swiveling toward sounds I couldn't hear. Around midnight, I finally fell into a fitful doze. I woke to Max growling. The sound was low, continuous, unlike anything I'd ever heard from him before. His lips were pulled back from his teeth and his hackles stood straight up. The growl wasn't directed at anything outside the tent. He was staring directly at me. "Max, what's wrong, boy?" At the sound of my voice, his growl intensified. His eyes reflected the faint starlight filtering through the tent fabric, and for a moment they seemed to shine with their own light. Then he blinked, shook his head, and was himself again, confused, panting slightly, nuzzling against my hand in apology. But the damage was done. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes, or the way his growl had sounded almost hungry. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. Still hours until dawn. I lay awake listening to Max's breathing, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe the altitude and stress were getting to me. Around 4 a.m., I heard the first whisper. It came from outside the tent, soft and sibilant, like wind through dry leaves. But there was no wind in Whisper Basin. The air remained perfectly still. I strained to make out words, but the sound was just at the edge of comprehension, familiar enough to almost understand, alien enough to make my skin crawl. Max heard it too. He lifted his head, ears pricked, but he didn't growl. Instead, he tilted his head as if listening intently, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. The whispering continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then faded away. I remained frozen in my sleeping bag until the first gray light of dawn crept into the tent. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the fly and look outside, I found my boots missing from where I'd left them by the tent entrance. I searched the entire campsite, but they were nowhere to be found. In their place sat a pair of hiking boots that looked identical to mine, but wrong in subtle ways. The laces were a slightly different shade of brown. The wear patterns on the soles didn't match my gait. The size tag inside read 8 instead of 7.5. I wore them anyway. What choice did I have? Max seemed more like himself in the daylight, but I noticed he kept sniffing at the boots and pulling away with a confused whine. We ate a quick breakfast, canned peaches for me, nothing for Max, who still refused to eat, and broke camp. I wanted out of Whisper Basin as quickly as possible, but when we reached the tree line where we'd entered the valley, the opening wasn't there. I circled the entire perimeter of the basin, searching for the way we'd come in. The walls rose smooth and unbroken on all sides, with no sign of the rocky drainage we'd followed. It was as if the valley had sealed itself behind us. My GPS still wasn't working properly, and my compass spun lazily without settling on any direction. According to the device, we were somehow located at coordinates that placed us in the middle of a lake 15 miles to the south. I tried my cell phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising given our location. But the screen showed something else troubling. The date was wrong. Instead of September 2nd, it read September 5th. 3 days had passed since we'd entered the basin, though I'd only slept one night. Max wandered close to the lake shore while I stood paralyzed by the impossibility of our situation. The water was so still it looked solid, like black glass. No ripples, no movement at all. I called to him to stay back, remembering the complete absence of any life in or around the water. That's when I saw the other campsites. They were scattered around the lake shore at irregular intervals, barely visible in the strange non-light that filled the basin. Tents, backpacks, camping gear, all sitting as if their owners had simply stepped away for a moment. Some of the equipment looked new, bright colors that should have been immediately obvious. Others were faded and weathered, as if they'd been there for years. I approached the nearest site cautiously. The tent was a modern ultralight design in bright orange, identical to one I'd considered buying. The rainfly was properly secured, but when I called out, no one answered. I unzipped the entrance and peered inside. The sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside. Personal items were scattered around: a paperback novel, reading glasses, a half-empty water bottle. Everything suggested the occupant had gotten up in the middle of the night and simply walked away. But there were no footprints leading from the tent to anywhere else. I checked 3 more campsites and found the same thing. Tents set up properly, gear organized, sleeping bags opened from within. No people, no tracks, no signs of struggle or disturbance. At the 4th site, I found something that made my blood freeze. A golden retriever sat calmly beside a blue tent, watching me approach. It looked exactly like Max. Same size, same coloring, same intelligent brown eyes. But when I called Max's name, both dogs turned to look at me. I spun around to see my Max about 20 yards behind me, perfectly positioned where I'd left him. But when I looked back at the blue tent, the second dog was gone. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the campsite. Max trotted up beside me and I reached down to touch his collar, needing the tactile confirmation that he was real. The metal tags were cold against my fingers and I could read his name and my phone number etched into the surface. But something was wrong with the text. The letters seemed to squirm and reshape themselves as I looked at them, spelling out words I didn't recognize in a language that hurt to perceive. I jerked my hand away and the tags appeared normal again. That afternoon, as the strange twilight that passed for day in Whisper Basin began to deepen, Max disappeared. I'd been trying to find a way out of the valley, following the base of the cliffs and looking for any crack or crevice that might lead to a passage. Max had been right beside me one moment, and the next, he was simply gone. No sound, no movement in my peripheral vision. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. I called his name until my throat was raw. I searched every inch of the basin floor, examined every boulder and tree that might conceal him. Nothing. It was as if he'd been erased from existence. As darkness fell, the absolute, suffocating darkness that seemed to rise from the lake itself, I heard him barking. The sound came from across the water, echoing off the valley walls with a hollow, distorted quality that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. But it was definitely Max's bark, with the particular rhythm he used when he wanted me to throw his tennis ball. "Max!" I shouted. "Where are you?" The barking stopped abruptly, replaced by that same sibilant whispering I'd heard the night before. But this time, I could almost make out words. They seemed to be in English, but spoken backwards, or upside down, or in some other configuration that my brain couldn't quite process. I stood at the lake shore, straining to see anything in the absolute darkness. The water was invisible, a void that seemed to swallow light, but I thought I could hear something moving out there, not swimming, but walking, as if the lake were only inches deep. Then Max barked again, much closer this time. I spun around and saw him sitting behind me, tail wagging, looking perfectly normal except for his eyes. In the dim starlight, they reflected with that same unnatural glow I'd seen in the tent. "Max, is that really you?" He cocked his head at the sound of my voice but didn't approach. When I stepped toward him, he backed away, maintaining the same distance between us. His movements were wrong somehow, too fluid, too graceful, like he was gliding rather than walking. I followed him across the basin floor as he led me in a slow circle around the lake. Other figures moved in my peripheral vision, shapes that might have been people or animals, always just at the edge of sight. When I tried to look at them directly, they vanished. Max stopped at one of the abandoned campsites, sitting beside a tent that I was certain hadn't been there before. This one was different from the others, older, with patches and repairs that spoke of years of hard use. The fabric was faded to an indeterminate color between brown and gray. As I approached, someone unzipped the tent from inside. A woman emerged, middle-aged with graying hair and kind eyes. She wore hiking clothes similar to mine, but they had the worn, lived-in quality of someone who'd been in the wilderness for a long time. She smiled when she saw me, a warm, genuine expression that should have been comforting. "Sarah," she said, and her voice was exactly like mine. "I've been waiting for you." My throat closed up. I tried to speak, but no sound emerged. "Don't be afraid," the woman continued, still wearing my voice like an ill-fitting mask. "I know it's confusing at first. The transition is always difficult." "Who are you?" I finally managed to whisper. "I'm you," she said simply. "Or rather, I'm who you're becoming. We all are." She gestured around the basin, and I saw them clearly for the first time, dozens of figures standing motionless around the lake shore. Men, women, children, all perfectly still, all watching me with the same patient, hungry expression. "The basin collects us," the woman who wore my voice explained, "draws us in when we're ready to change. Some come alone, some with companions, but everyone who enters Whisper Basin eventually joins the family." "I want to leave," I said, backing away. "I want to go home." She nodded sympathetically. "Of course you do. I felt the same way. But look around, Sarah. Look how peaceful it is here. No stress, no disappointment, no messy emotions. Just the hunger, pure and simple. Hunger for warmth, for life, for the complicated, beautiful energy that flows through living things." Her smile widened, and I saw that her teeth were too long, too sharp. "You've felt it beginning, haven't you? The way food tastes wrong now, the way your own body feels strange and distant." I had felt it. The metallic taste in my mouth, the way my skin seemed to belong to someone else, the disconnection from my own physical form that had been growing stronger since we'd entered the valley. "Max," I called, looking around for my dog. "He's already joined us," the woman said. "The transition is easier for animals, less resistance to the change." The golden retriever I'd been following padded over to sit beside her. In the strange light, I could see through him, as if he were made of smoke and shadows shaped into a familiar form. "He's not real," I breathed. "None of us are, in the way you understand it. But we're not gone either. We're something new, something hungry." The figures around the lake shore began to move closer, closing the circle around me. They moved with that same fluid grace I'd noticed in the fake Max, gliding rather than walking. Their faces were human, but empty, like beautiful masks with nothing behind them. "The hunger grows stronger every day," the woman continued. "Soon you'll understand why we stay here, why we lure others to join us. The basin needs fresh life to sustain itself, and we need the warmth that only the living can provide." I ran. Terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed, and I sprinted across the basin floor toward the cliffs. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but moving with inexorable purpose. They didn't need to hurry. Where could I go in a valley with no exits? But I had to try. I scrambled up the loose rock at the base of the cliff, my fingers finding holes in the granite, pulling myself higher despite the crushing weight of my pack. Below me, the figures gathered at the base of the wall, looking up with patient, empty eyes. The rock face was steeper than it appeared from below, but desperation drove me upward. 20 feet, 30, 40. My muscles screamed and my lungs burned, but I kept climbing. If I could reach the rim, maybe I could find a way out of this nightmare. That's when I felt the first touch. Fingers, impossibly long and cold, wrapped around my ankle. I looked down to see the woman who wore my voice climbing below me, her limbs elongated and spider-like, her mouth open to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Don't fight it, Sarah," she said, and her voice echoed from all around the valley. "The hunger is beautiful once you stop resisting." I kicked frantically, trying to dislodge her grip, but more hands reached for me. Dozens of them, emerging from cracks in the rock face that shouldn't have been able to hide human forms. The cliff itself seemed to be alive, reaching for me with grasping fingers. My pack strap caught on a protruding rock, jerking me to a halt. In that moment of vulnerability, they swarmed over me. The cold was indescribable. It seeped through my clothes, my skin, into my bones and blood. Each touch drained something vital from me, leaving behind an emptiness that ached worse than any physical pain. I felt my warmth, my life, my very humanity being drawn out through their fingers. But in that moment of absolute despair, something unexpected happened. Max barked. Not the hollow, echoing sound I'd heard across the lake, but the real bark of my real dog, sharp, urgent, protective. And with it came warmth, a tiny spark of genuine life in the midst of the draining cold. The creatures recoiled slightly, and I saw him, the actual Max, not the shadow thing that had been leading me around the basin. He was crouched on a ledge above me, hackles raised, barking with desperate fury at the things that held me. "Max!" I screamed, and the sound of my own voice, my real voice, seemed to drive the creatures back another step. I wrenched free of their grasping hands and scrambled toward my dog. He bounded down to meet me, his solid, warm body the most real thing I'd felt since entering the valley. Together, we climbed higher, the creatures pursuing but seemingly unable to reach us as long as Max's barking continued. At the rim of the cliff, I found what I'd been looking for, a narrow gap in the rock that led away from the basin. It was barely wide enough for a human body, but it was a way out. Max squeezed through first, and I followed, feeling the terrible cold recede behind me. The passage was long and dark, twisting through the mountain's heart like a wormhole. But eventually, it opened onto a familiar forest of lodgepole pines. My GPS flickered to life, showing our position as somewhere near the original trail. The date was correct again, September 2nd, just after sunset. We'd lost only a few hours, not days. I didn't stop moving until we reached the trailhead parking lot. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it, and I'd never been so happy to see a piece of machinery in my life. Max jumped into the passenger seat without being asked, pressing close against me as I started the engine. The drive back to Salt Lake City passed in a blur of headlights and half-remembered terror. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see those empty, hungry faces following us down the highway. But there was only normal traffic, normal people going about their normal lives. It wasn't until I was safely home, door locked, that I allowed myself to fully process what had happened. Max seemed normal again, eating his kibble, drinking water, playing with his toys. The only sign of our ordeal was the way he sometimes stared at dark corners of the house, as if seeing things that weren't quite there. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? Instead, I threw away my camping gear, sold my truck, and moved to Phoenix. I told myself I needed a change of scenery, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't bear to be anywhere near mountains. But the hunger followed me anyway. It started small, food tasting wrong, the way it had in Whisper Basin. Then came the disconnection from my own body, the feeling that my skin belonged to someone else. Some mornings I wake up and don't recognize the face in the mirror, as if the woman looking back at me is wearing a Sarah Rodriguez mask. Max feels it too. Sometimes I catch him staring at me with the same wariness he showed those shadow things in the valley. He sleeps at the foot of my bed instead of beside me now, and he won't let me pet him when the hunger is strongest. Because it is hunger. The woman in the valley was right about that much. A craving for warmth, for life, for the complex energy that flows through living beings. It's subtle at first, just an emptiness that ordinary food can't fill. but it grows stronger every day. I've started visiting crowded places, malls, concerts, busy restaurants, not to feed, not yet, but to feel the warmth radiating from all those lives around me. It helps, temporarily, but I know it won't be enough forever. Sometimes, late at night, I research missing hikers in the Utah wilderness. There are more than you'd expect. People who simply vanish without a trace, usually solo campers or small groups. The search and rescue teams find their gear, their vehicles, sometimes even their tracks leading to the wilderness edge. But the people themselves are never found. I wonder if they made it to their own versions of Whisper Basin. I wonder if they're still there, hungry and patient, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into their trap. And I wonder how long I have before the hunger wins. Last week, my neighbor's cat went missing. I found it in my backyard the next morning, drained and cold, its eyes reflecting a light that wasn't there. Max wouldn't go near it, and I had to call animal control to take the body away. I told them it must have been hit by a car, but we both knew that wasn't true. The hunger is getting stronger, and my resistance is getting weaker. Some nights I stand at my window, staring out at the lights of Phoenix, feeling the warmth of all those sleeping families radiating through their walls. It would be so easy to go to them, to take just a little of what they have. They'd never know. Just a touch, just enough to fill the emptiness inside me. But Max is watching. He's always watching now, ready to bark if I get too close to that line. He's the only thing keeping me human, the only anchor I have to what I used to be. I don't know how much longer he can hold me. I don't know how much longer I want him to. The woman in Whisper Basin said the transition was inevitable, that everyone who enters the valley eventually joins the family. Maybe she was right. Maybe I'm just delaying the inevitable, clinging to a humanity that's already been compromised. But for now, I'm still Sarah Rodriguez. I'm still 28 years old, and I'm still fighting, even if I'm not sure I'm going to win. Max just growled at something outside the window. It's past midnight, and the neighborhood is quiet except for the distant hum of traffic, but he's staring into the darkness with that same intensity he showed in the basin, and his hackles are standing straight up. I should go check what he's looking at. I should see what's out there in the dark, but I'm afraid of what I might find, and I'm more afraid of what might find me. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the high Uintas in northeastern Utah, where the ancient peaks scrape against a sky that seems too vast and too empty, where the silence between the trees holds secrets that should never be disturbed. David and I had been planning this backpacking trip for months. 3 days, 2 nights in the backcountry near Kings Peak, Utah's highest summit. We'd been together for 2 years, and this was supposed to be our celebration. I'd finally gotten the promotion at the marketing firm, and David had just finished his master's thesis in geology. We were young, in love, and convinced that the world belonged to us. The trailhead at Henry's Fork was nearly deserted when we arrived that Friday morning in late September. The aspens had already begun their transformation, their leaves a brilliant gold that trembled in the thin mountain air. David adjusted his pack straps and grinned at me, that crooked smile that had first caught my attention at a coffee shop 2 years earlier. "Ready for some real adventure, babe?" He kissed my forehead, and I breathed in his familiar scent. Soap, pine from his aftershave, and something uniquely him that I couldn't name but that made me feel safe. As ready as I'll ever be. I shouldered my own pack, heavier than it should have been because David had insisted I bring the good sleeping bag. He was always looking out for me like that. The first few miles passed in comfortable conversation. David pointed out geological formations, his voice animated as he explained how glaciers had carved these valleys millions of years ago. I half listened, more focused on the rhythm of our boots on the trail and the way the light filtered through the canopy above. Everything felt perfect, pristine, like we were the first people to ever walk this path. But as we climbed higher, something began to feel off. It started with my GPS. The device showed our location jumping erratically, first placing us a mile north of the trail, then indicating we were somehow moving backward despite continuing forward. David laughed it off, pulling out the paper map and compass he'd insisted on bringing. "Technology fails, geology doesn't," he said, spreading the map on a flat boulder. But when he tried to orient us, his brow furrowed. The compass needle spun slowly, uncertain, finally settling on a direction that didn't match any of our landmarks. "Probably mineral deposits," David muttered, but his voice had lost some of its usual confidence. "The Uintas are full of weird magnetic anomalies." We pressed on, following what we thought was the trail, but the path seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at it. Side branches appeared where none had been marked on the map. Familiar rock formations vanished behind us when we turned to check our progress. By late afternoon, we should have reached our planned campsite at Dollar Lake. Instead, we found ourselves in a small clearing surrounded by aspens whose leaves had turned an unsettling shade of gray-brown, as if they were dying from the inside out. The air here felt thick, oppressive, and carried a faint smell of decay that made my stomach turn. "This isn't right," I said, dropping my pack and pulling out the water bottle. The liquid inside had a strange metallic taste that lingered on my tongue. David was studying the map again, turning it in his hands like the answer might reveal itself if he just looked at it from the right angle. "We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, but I don't understand how. I've been following the trail markers." That's when we realized we hadn't seen a trail marker in over an hour. We decided to make camp there for the night, planning to retrace our steps in the morning. David worked on setting up the tent while I gathered wood for a fire, but the branches I collected felt wrong in my hands. Too soft, almost spongy, and they left a residue on my palms that smelled like rotting meat. When I tried to light the fire, the flames sparked blue for just a moment before settling into a normal orange glow. David didn't notice. He was too busy fighting with the tent stakes, cursing under his breath as they refused to bite into the strangely soft earth. We ate a silent dinner of trail mix and jerky, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The forest around us had fallen completely quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals, not even the sound of wind in the trees. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water. "David," I said finally, my voice seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. "What if we're lost?" He reached across the space between us and took my hand. His fingers were cold, colder than they should have been, but his touch was still comforting. "We'll figure it out tomorrow, I promise." That night I dreamed of something watching us from the tree line. In my dream, it had David's face, but the eyes were wrong. Too bright, too hungry. I woke several times, heart pounding to find David sleeping peacefully beside me, his breathing slow and even. But each time I drifted back to sleep, the dream returned, and the thing with David's face crept closer to our tent. The second day began with small disasters. Our water bottles were empty, though I distinctly remembered filling them the night before. David's hiking boots had somehow collected a thick layer of mud despite the dry conditions, and the mud had an oily sheen that reminded me unpleasantly of blood. We broke camp quickly, both of us eager to find our way back to the main trail. But as we hiked, the landscape seemed to shift around us. Valleys we remembered crossing appeared ahead of us again. Rock formations we'd used as landmarks showed up on our left when they should have been on our right. "It's like the forest is playing tricks on us," I said, trying to keep my voice light despite the growing knot of anxiety in my chest. David stopped walking and turned to look at me. For just a moment his face seemed different, the features slightly off, as if someone had tried to recreate his appearance from memory and gotten the proportions wrong. But then he blinked, and he was himself again. "Don't be ridiculous," he said, but his voice sounded strained. "It's just disorientation. Happens to everyone in unfamiliar terrain." By midday, we were both exhausted and increasingly desperate. The sun overhead seemed wrong somehow. Too dim, casting shadows that fell in directions that defied logic. When I tried to use the sun to navigate, It appeared to be in 3 different positions at once, depending on which angle I looked from. That's when we heard it. A child crying, somewhere in the forest ahead of us. The sound was heartbreaking, desperate, the wailing of a small child who was lost and afraid. Without thinking, we both started toward the sound, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to part before us like curtains. "Hello," David called out. "Are you okay? Where are you?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt like the world had paused to listen. We stood in a small grove of pine trees, their needles brown and brittle despite the early season. In the center of the grove was a circle of stones that looked like they'd been arranged by human hands, and in the center of that circle was a child's hiking boot. Just one boot. Small, maybe size 2, with bright red laces that seemed to glow against the dark earth. "Jesus Christ," David whispered, and his voice sounded strange, hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I bent to examine the boot more closely. It was clean, almost new, with no signs of wear or weathering. But when I touched it, my fingers came away sticky with something dark and viscous. "David, we need to leave. Now." But when I looked up, he was gone. "David!" I called, my voice cracking. "David!" The forest swallowed my shouts without an echo. I spun in a circle, searching for any sign of him, but the trees seemed to press closer with each turn, their branches reaching toward me like gnarled fingers. I spent the next 3 hours searching, calling his name until my throat was raw. The sun never seemed to move, stuck in that same wrong position, casting those impossible shadows. My watch had stopped working, the hands frozen at 2:17, though I couldn't remember what time it had been when I last checked. Finally, as panic began to override rational thought, I heard David's voice calling my name from somewhere to the east. I crashed through the undergrowth toward the sound, branches tearing at my clothes and face until I burst into another clearing where David stood waiting for me. "Sarah, thank God," he said, moving toward me with arms outstretched. "I got turned around, couldn't find you anywhere." I threw myself into his embrace, sobbing with relief. But as he held me, something felt wrong. His body was too cold, and his heartbeat seemed off, too slow, too regular, like a metronome rather than the irregular rhythm of human circulation. "Where were you?" I pulled back to look at his face. He looked like David, same dark hair, same brown eyes, same crooked nose from when he'd broken it in high school playing basketball. But something in his expression was subtly different, like a photograph that had been slightly out of focus. "I was looking for you," he said, and his voice was David's voice. But the cadence was wrong, too measured, too careful. "We should set up camp. It's getting dark." I looked up at the sky. The sun hadn't moved, still hanging in that impossible position, but somehow the light was fading anyway. Shadows were stretching across the clearing despite the static sun, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. We made camp in silence. David moved differently now, his gestures too precise, like he was consciously thinking about each movement instead of acting naturally. When I handed him his sleeping bag, our fingers touched, and his skin felt like cold rubber. That night I lay awake listening to the thing that looked like David breathe beside me. The rhythm was wrong, too slow, with pauses that lasted too long. Sometimes in the darkness I thought I heard other sounds, a wet, sliding noise like something moving beneath his skin. Twice I felt him looking at me, but when I opened my eyes, he appeared to be sleeping. The third time, I kept my eyes closed and listened. I heard him sit up quietly, heard the soft whisper of the tent zipper opening, heard his footsteps moving away into the forest. I waited 10 minutes, then followed. The moon was dark, but somehow I could see perfectly, another wrongness in a night full of them. David was standing in the center of the clearing, perfectly still, his back to me. As I watched, his head began to turn, rotating further than any human head should be able to turn, until he was looking directly at me while his body remained facing away. His face was David's face, but his eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. His mouth opened in what might have been a smile, but his teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too many, arranged in rows like a shark's. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was wrong too, coming from somewhere deeper than his throat. "Why aren't you sleeping?" I ran. I crashed through the forest blindly, branches whipping across my face, roots catching my feet. Behind me, I could hear David, or the thing that looked like David, following at a leisurely pace. It didn't need to hurry. Where was I going to go? I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing behind a fallen log. In the distance, I could hear it calling my name in David's voice, but wrong, always wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Sarah. Where are you, Sarah? I'm worried about you, baby. You're acting strange." I pressed my hands over my mouth to muffle my sobbing. How long had it been wearing David's face? When had the real David disappeared? Had I been sleeping next to this thing last night, letting it touch me, hold me? The calling stopped. The forest fell silent again, that unnatural silence that pressed against my skull. I waited, counting my heartbeats, trying to decide what to do next. That's when I felt breath on the back of my neck. "Found you," David's voice whispered directly into my ear. I screamed and rolled away, but there was nothing there. Just empty forest, shadows, and the scent of decay that was becoming stronger by the moment. I stumbled to my feet and started running again, no longer caring about direction or destination. I just needed to get away from that voice, that face, that thing that was wearing my boyfriend like a costume. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. No matter which way I turned, I found myself running deeper into the wilderness, further from any hope of rescue. The trees grew larger and more twisted, their bark scarred with symbols that looked almost like writing in a language I didn't recognize. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through branches that seemed to absorb more illumination than they reflected. I was exhausted, dehydrated, my clothes torn and my face scratched bloody. But I was alive, and I was alone. Or so I thought. "Sarah!" David's voice calling from somewhere behind me. But this time it sounded normal. Worried, afraid, human. I turned to see him crashing through the undergrowth, his face streaked with dirt and tears. "Sarah? Thank God. I've been looking for you all night. What happened? Why did you run away?" He looked like David. He sounded like David. He moved like David, with that slight limp from an old soccer injury. But I had learned not to trust appearances in this place. "Stay away from me," I said, backing up against a tree. "Sarah, it's me. It's David. I don't know what happened. I woke up and you were gone. I've been searching everywhere." He took a step closer, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "Baby, you're scaring me." "Prove it," I said. "Tell me something only David would know." He smiled, that crooked smile I'd fallen in love with. "You have a scar on your hip from when you fell off your bike when you were 7. You're afraid of butterflies because one got tangled in your hair when you were 4 and you thought it was trying to eat you. You cry during romantic comedies but never during horror movies. Your favorite food is your grandmother's tamales, but you've never been able to make them yourself because she won't share the recipe." All true, all things only David would know. But somehow none of it felt right coming from his mouth. "You hate the way I leave my socks on the bedroom floor," he continued, taking another step closer. "You pretend to be asleep when I get up early for runs because you like watching me get dressed. You want to get married someday, but you're afraid I'll say no, so you've never brought it up." That last one hit me like a physical blow. I had never told anyone about that fear, had barely admitted it to myself. How could this thing know? Unless— "David?" I whispered, hope and terror warring in my chest. "Of course it's me. Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." But even as relief flooded through me, something felt off. David was touching his face as he spoke, his fingers tracing his features like he was making sure they were still there. And his eyes, They kept darting to the side as if he was reading cue cards. "What do you remember about last night?" I asked carefully. "I remember going to sleep. Then I woke up and you were gone." His hand moved to his neck, fingers probing at the skin there. "I feel strange, Sarah, like I'm not quite myself." That's when I saw it, a thin line around his hairline, barely visible, like a seam where two pieces of fabric had been sewn together. "David," I said slowly, "look at your hands." He held them up, staring at his palms with confusion. The skin was too smooth, too perfect, like plastic. And his fingerprints. They were smudged, indistinct, as if someone had tried to recreate them but hadn't quite gotten the details right. "I don't understand," he said, and for the first time his voice carried genuine emotion. Fear, confusion, a desperate need to understand what was happening to him. "Sarah, I don't understand what's wrong with me." "You're not David," I said, though saying it felt like swallowing glass. "I am," he insisted, but his voice was breaking. "I remember everything. I remember our first date, that terrible Italian place where the waiter spilled wine on your dress. I remember the first time we said we loved each other, in your apartment during that thunderstorm. I remember this morning, waking up and planning to propose to you at the summit." My heart stopped. "What?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. His hands were shaking as he opened it, revealing a simple diamond ring that caught the gray morning light. "I was going to ask you at King's Peak. I had it all planned out." I stared at the ring, at David's face, at the impossible situation I found myself in. This thing knew David's memories, his feelings, even his plans that he'd never shared with me. But it wasn't him. It couldn't be him, could it? "Sarah," he said, and his voice was small, broken. "I'm scared. I feel like I'm disappearing, like something is eating me from the inside out." As he spoke, I noticed his face was beginning to change. The features were softening, becoming less distinct, like a photograph left in the sun. The seam around his hairline was becoming more visible, and through it, I could see something dark and wet moving beneath. "Help me," he whispered. "Please, Sarah, help me." But even as he pleaded, his face continued to deteriorate. His left eye began to droop, the skin around it becoming slack and gray. His mouth was losing its shape, the lips becoming indistinct from the surrounding flesh. I wanted to help him. God, how I wanted to help him. But what could I do? How do you save someone who might not even be real? That's when the thing that was wearing David's failing face smiled at me, and I saw something move behind his dissolving features. Something dark and hungry and utterly inhuman. "Thank you," it said in a voice that was no longer David's, "for loving him so much. His memories taste so much sweeter when they're seasoned with genuine emotion." I ran again, but this time I knew it was hopeless. The forest was the thing's territory, and I was just food that had wandered into its pantry. Behind me, I could hear David's voice calling my name, but it was wrong again, distorted, like a recording played through broken speakers. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until my legs gave out and I collapsed beside a stream I didn't remember crossing. The water was black as oil and smelled like copper. When I cupped it in my hands, it felt warm and thick, almost viscous. That's when I saw my reflection in the dark water and screamed. My face was changing too. The features were shifting, becoming less defined, like someone was erasing them with a gentle hand. I touched my cheek and felt my fingers sink slightly into skin that had become as soft as clay. The thing had been feeding on me too, slowly, carefully, savoring the process. How long had it been wearing pieces of my identity? How much of me was already gone? I staggered to my feet, my vision blurring as my eyes began to lose their shape. In the distance, I could see David, or what was left of him, approaching through the trees. His face was almost completely gone now, just a smooth expanse of gray flesh with two black holes where his eyes should have been. "Come back, Sarah," it called in a voice like wind through dead leaves. "Let me finish what I started. It won't hurt much longer." But I wasn't going to make it easy. Even as my body betrayed me, even as my thoughts became sluggish and my memories began to fade, I fought. I stumbled away from the stream, deeper into the forest, looking for somewhere to hide, somewhere to make my final stand. That's when I saw the trail marker. It was old, faded, but unmistakably real. A wooden post with a yellow blaze painted on it, pointing back toward civilization, toward escape. With the last of my strength, I followed it. Each step was agony as my dissolving muscles struggled to support my weight, but I kept moving. Behind me, the thing that had been David howled in frustration, the sound echoing through the forest like breaking glass. The trail led upward, climbing toward a ridge I recognized from the map. If I could just reach the top, I might be able to see the main trail, might be able to find my way back to the trailhead. My body was failing rapidly now. My vision was fragmenting, splitting into multiple overlapping images. My hands were becoming translucent, and I could see the trail through my dissolving fingers. But I kept climbing, driven by a determination that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than consciousness. At the top of the ridge I saw them. 2 hikers, real hikers, a middle-aged couple with genuine gear and worried expressions. They were searching for something, calling out names. "Help!" I tried to shout, but my voice was barely a whisper. "Help me!" They saw me and rushed over, their faces filled with concern and confusion. "Miss, are you all right? We're with Search and Rescue. We're looking for 2 missing hikers, Sarah Rodriguez and David Chen. You match the description of—" "I'm Sarah," I managed to say, though I wasn't sure if my mouth was still capable of forming words. "David. David is gone." They wrapped me in emergency blankets and radioed for evacuation. As we waited for the helicopter, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. How could I tell them about the thing that wore faces like masks? How could I describe the way it fed on memory and identity? They found David's body 3 days later, at the bottom of a ravine 5 miles from where I was rescued. The coroner said he'd been dead for at least 72 hours, meaning he'd died on our first night in the forest, around the time I'd dreamed of something watching us from the tree line. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from severe dehydration and exposure. The doctors said it was a miracle I'd survived, that I should have died from hypothermia alone. They asked about my injuries, the strange burns on my face and hands, the way my fingerprints had been somehow abraded away. I told them I didn't remember. But I do remember. I remember everything, even the parts the thing tried to steal from me. I remember David's real face, not the pale imitation that wore his features in those final hours. I remember the weight of his hand in mine, the way he hummed while he cooked, the plans we'd made for our future together. The hardest part is knowing that somewhere in those mountains the thing that killed him is still wearing scraps of his identity like trophies. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine I can hear David's voice calling my name from the darkness beyond my bedroom window. But it's not really him. It's never really him. I moved to the city after the funeral, as far from the mountains as I could get. I changed my name, my career, my entire life. But I can't escape the knowledge of what's out there, waiting in the wild places where human beings dare to venture. The engagement ring was never found. Sometimes I wonder if the thing kept it, a memento of the love it destroyed. Or maybe it's still there, in that cursed clearing, waiting for the next couple to find it and wonder at its presence in such a remote place. I never went camping again. I never will, because I know now that some places aren't meant for human beings, that there are things in the wilderness older and hungrier than we can imagine, things that wear our faces and speak with our voices, things that feed on the bonds between us and leave nothing but hollow shells in their wake. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the high Uintas of northeastern Utah, and it changed everything about who I am and how I see the world. But sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I really escaped at all. Sometimes I catch my reflection looking wrong in mirrors, my features subtly off, like a photograph that's been slightly out of focus. Sometimes I find myself touching my face, checking to make sure the seams don't show. Because what if the real Sarah Rodriguez died in those mountains with David? What if the thing that feeds on identity decided it needed a more permanent disguise, a way to walk among humans without detection? What if I'm not who I think I am? The worst part is, I'll never know for sure, and neither will you. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Utah's Uinta Mountains 3 weeks ago, though time feels meaningless now. I should have listened to the park ranger who gave me that look, the one that said I was making a mistake venturing alone into the backcountry with only my German shepherd, Kodiak, for company. But I needed the solitude. After losing my job at the marketing firm and my relationship falling apart in the same week, I craved the kind of silence that only the wilderness could provide. Kodiak had been my constant companion for 5 years, a loyal shadow with intelligent amber eyes and an uncanny ability to sense danger before I did. He'd saved me from a rattlesnake in Arizona and kept me warm during an unexpected snowstorm in Colorado. If anyone could handle the Uinta wilderness with me, it was him. The Echo Trail was supposedly a moderate 3-day loop through some of the most pristine terrain in Utah. Remote enough to avoid crowds, challenging enough to demand focus, beautiful enough to heal whatever was broken inside me. At least, that's what I told myself as I shouldered my 40-pound pack and set off from the Mirror Lake trailhead that crisp October morning. The first sign something was wrong came 6 hours in. I'd been following the trail markers religiously, checking my GPS every 30 minutes when the device suddenly showed nothing but static snow. I tapped the screen, powered it off and on, checked the satellite view, nothing. The electronic compass spun wildly before freezing on northeast, which made no sense given our southwestern trajectory. "Piece of junk," I muttered, pulling out my backup paper map. But the topographical lines seemed to swim before my eyes, the trail markings fading and reappearing like mirages. I blinked hard, attributed it to altitude and dehydration, and pressed on. Kodiak had stopped ahead, ears erect, staring into the dense stands of aspen and fir that crowded the trail. His hackles weren't raised, but something in his posture made my stomach clench. "What is it, boy?" I whispered. He whined softly, a sound I'd never heard from him before, uncertain, almost pleading. But after a moment, he resumed walking, though his gait had changed. Instead of his usual confident trot, he moved with careful, measured steps, as if the ground might give way beneath him. By evening, we'd covered 8 miles according to my calculations, but the landmarks didn't match my map. The distinctive granite outcropping marked as Eagle's Perch was nowhere to be seen, and the small alpine lake where I'd planned to camp remained elusive. Instead, we found ourselves in a clearing I didn't recognize, surrounded by trees that seemed too tall, too dark, their branches interlocking overhead like gnarled fingers. I set up camp with mechanical precision, trying to ignore the way the silence felt alive around us. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, no wind through the leaves. Even the sound of my tent stakes driving into the earth seemed muffled, as if the forest were swallowing every noise. The campfire refused to light. I tried 3 times with dry kindling and fatwood, checked my lighter, rearranged the logs. Each time the flames would sputter and die within seconds, leaving behind an acrid smell that made my eyes water. Finally, I gave up, opting for my camp stove instead, though the blue flame cast eerie shadows that danced and writhed like living things. Kodiak refused to eat his dinner, something that had never happened in all our years together. He lay beside my tent, head on his paws, watching the tree line with unwavering focus. When I offered him water, he lapped it up eagerly, but his kibble remained untouched. "Not feeling well, buddy?" I scratched behind his ears, but he didn't lean into my touch the way he usually did. Instead, he remained rigid, alert, waiting. I woke around 3 a.m. to absolute silence. The forest had gone completely dead. No night sounds, no insect chirping, nothing. Even Kodiak's breathing seemed to have stopped. I fumbled for my headlamp, clicking it on, and nearly screamed. My sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, though I clearly remembered zipping it up before sleep. The fabric was pulled back in a perfect V-shape, as if something had carefully, deliberately opened it while I slept. But that was impossible. I would have felt it, would have woken up. Kodiak was gone. I shot upright, heart hammering, and crawled out of my tent. "Kodiak!" I whispered urgently, then louder. "Kodiak!" Nothing. Not even an echo, which was strange in this mountain terrain. My voice seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, swallowed whole. I spent the next 4 hours searching with my headlamp, calling his name until my throat was raw. I followed what looked like paw prints in the soft earth, but they led in circles, sometimes appearing to overlap in ways that defied physics. At one point I could have sworn I saw 2 sets of tracks, one going out, one coming back, but when I looked closer with better light, there was only confused scuffing in the dirt. As dawn finally broke, I heard familiar panting behind me. Kodiak sat at the edge of camp, tail wagging, tongue lolling out in a doggy grin. He looked perfectly normal, perfectly healthy, perfectly fine. Relief flooded through me so intensely I nearly fell to my knees. "Where were you, boy? You scared me to death." But as he trotted toward me, something felt off. His gait was too fluid, too precise. The intelligence in his amber eyes seemed sharper, more calculating. And when he pressed against my legs in greeting, his body felt wrong. Not quite the right temperature, not quite the right texture. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of getting lost was making me imagine things. Dogs wandered off sometimes. This was his first time in truly wild country. Maybe he'd caught an interesting scent and lost track of time. The important thing was that he was back. We broke camp quickly. I wanted to find the main trail, get back to familiar territory, return to the world of cell towers and GPS signals and logical explanations. But as we hiked, the forest seemed to grow more oppressive. The canopy overhead thickened until barely any sunlight penetrated, casting everything in a green-tinged twilight that made it impossible to judge the time. Kodiak led the way now, which was unusual. Normally, he stayed close to my side or behind me, but today he ranged ahead, seeming to know exactly where he was going. His movements were different too, more predatory, more purposeful. Several times I called him back, but he ignored me completely, something he'd never done before. Around what I estimated to be midday, we came upon another campsite. It was clearly abandoned, but recently, maybe a day or 2 at most. A blue tent sat collapsed and torn, its fabric shredded as if by massive claws. Camping gear was scattered everywhere. A sleeping bag ripped open with its stuffing floating like snow, a camp stove crushed into twisted metal, food containers burst and empty. What made my blood freeze was the smell. It wasn't the clean scent of decomposition I knew from hunting with my father as a child. This was something else, sweet and cloying, with an underlying chemical tang that made my gag reflex kick in. It reminded me of the formaldehyde smell from high school biology class, but wrong, somehow, tainted. Kodiak sniffed around the campsite with obvious interest, his tail wagging. At one point, he picked up what looked like a piece of fabric and began to chew on it. When I got closer, I realized it wasn't fabric at all. It was skin. Human skin, pale and soft, with fine blonde hairs still attached. "Drop it!" I shouted, but he looked at me with those 2 intelligent eyes and swallowed it whole. I stumbled backward, mind reeling. My dog, my loyal, well-trained companion, had just eaten human flesh. And he'd enjoyed it. That's when I noticed the footprints around the destroyed campsite. Boot prints, heading away into the forest. Fresh enough that whoever had been here might still be alive, might need help. But mixed in with the human tracks were paw prints that looked exactly like Kodiak's, prints that showed him arriving at the campsite before the destruction occurred. I wanted to run, but where could I go? I was lost in thousands of acres of wilderness with no working GPS, no cell service, and a dog that might not be my dog anymore. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to get away from this place, but logical thought insisted I was having some kind of breakdown, seeing threats where none existed. Kodiak had finished investigating the campsite and now sat watching me with his head tilted as if waiting for a decision. In the filtered sunlight, his fur looked different. Darker somehow, with an oily sheen that hadn't been there before. And his eyes. They reflected light like a nocturnal animal's, even in daylight. I made a choice that probably saved my life. I ran. Not away from Kodiak, but away from the campsite, crashing through underbrush and over fallen logs in blind panic. Behind me, I heard him following, but his gait sounded wrong. Too many legs, or legs in the wrong places. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing against a massive pine tree. When I turned around, Kodiak was sitting calmly 20 feet away, looking like a perfectly normal dog again. His breathing wasn't even elevated. "What are you?" I whispered. He tilted his head and whined softly, the same uncertain sound from yesterday, but now it felt like mockery. As night fell, I refused to sleep. I sat with my back against the tree, camp stove hissing softly for warmth and light, watching the thing that wore my dog's face. It lay in a perfect sphinx position, never taking its eyes off me. Occasionally, it would yawn, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. Hours passed. My eyelids grew heavy despite my terror, and I found myself nodding off. Each time I jolted awake, Kodiak was in a slightly different position, always closer. By 3 a.m., he was close enough that I could feel his breath on my face, cold breath that smelled like copper and decay. That's when I heard the voices. They came from the darkness beyond my small circle of light, multiple voices calling my name. Men and women, young and old, all with perfect pronunciation. Sarah Rodriguez. Sarah Rodriguez. Sarah Rodriguez. But the voices were wrong. They had the cadence of human speech, but none of the warmth. Each syllable was perfectly enunciated, as if being read from a script by something that had studied human language but never felt human emotion. Kodiak's head swiveled toward the voices, and his tail began to wag. Sarah Rodriguez. The voices continued, growing closer. "We've been looking for you. We found your dog. We've been taking good care of him." A beam of light swept through the trees. A flashlight, or what looked like one. Then another, and another. Soon I could see figures moving in the darkness, silhouettes that appeared human but moved with that same too fluid gait I'd noticed in the thing beside me. "Sarah Rodriguez," they called again. "Come home with us. Come back to camp. We have food. We have warmth. We have answers." The thing that looked like Kodiak stood up and began walking toward the voices, pausing to look back at me expectantly. Its eyes gleamed in the lamplight, and for just a moment I saw its true face, something ancient and hungry, with too many teeth and intelligence that predated human civilization by millennia. "Sarah Rodriguez," the voices sang in unison now, a chorus of perfect human speech that had never belonged to human throats. "Your dog is here. Your real dog. Come see." And then I heard him, my actual Kodiak, whimpering somewhere in the darkness beyond the false lights. Weak, frightened, but unmistakably him. They had him. They were using him as bait. I made the hardest decision of my life. I stayed put. Every instinct screamed at me to rescue him, but I knew it was a trap. Whatever these things were, they'd already taken my dog's form to get close to me. If I went to them now, I'd never leave these woods. The voices grew more insistent, more urgent. "Sarah Rodriguez. He's hurt. He needs you. He's calling for you." Kodiak's whimpering grew louder, more desperate. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to run toward that sound. Then, abruptly, everything went silent. The false lights disappeared. The voices stopped. Even Kodiak's cries faded away. The thing that had been wearing his face was gone too, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. I sat alone in the circle of my camp stove's blue light, surrounded by a darkness so complete it felt solid. And in that darkness I heard new sounds, wet, sliding noises, like something massive moving through thick mud, breathing that came from too many mouths, the crack of breaking bone. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with terror, listening to the sounds of something feeding. When dawn finally came, the forest was normal again. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. If not for the empty dog collar hanging from my pack, I might have convinced myself it was all a nightmare. But the collar was real. Kodiak's collar with his tag still attached, though I had no memory of removing it from his neck. I hiked out of there on pure adrenaline, following the sun east until I hit a recognizable trail. It took me 14 hours to reach the parking area, where my Jeep sat exactly where I'd left it 3 days earlier. The park ranger who checked on me looked concerned when he saw my state. Wild-eyed, exhausted, rambling about getting lost. "Did you see any other hikers out there?" I asked him. "A blonde woman, maybe? Someone with a blue tent?" He shook his head. "Haven't had anyone on the Echo Trail in over a month. That section's been marked as impassable due to seasonal flooding." "Flooding?" "Yeah, the whole lower portion is underwater right now. Has been since the spring runoff. Impossible to get through." He studied my face carefully. "You sure you were on the Echo Trail?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore. That was 3 weeks ago. I've been staying with my sister in Salt Lake City since then, too afraid to return to my apartment, too shaken to be alone. I've reported Kodiak missing to every shelter and rescue organization in Utah, posted his picture on social media, offered a reward. Deep down, I know I'll never see him again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear scratching at my sister's door. Familiar scratching, like a dog wanting to come in. When I look through the peephole, there's nothing there. But on the ground, I can see paw prints in the dust, prints that are too big, with claws too long, leading away into the darkness. And yesterday, my sister found something buried in her backyard. "Dog treats," she said, though she doesn't have a dog. When she showed them to me, they weren't treats at all. They were human teeth, small and white, arranged in neat little piles like offerings. I'm writing this down because I need people to know what's out there in the Utah wilderness. Something old, something hungry, something that can wear any face it chooses. It learned my dog's form perfectly, studied his mannerisms, his loyalty, his love. It used that against me. If you're planning to hike the Uinta Mountains, especially anywhere near the Echo Trail, please reconsider. If you go anyway, don't go alone. Don't trust your GPS. Don't trust your map. And if your companion starts acting strange, even if it's just small things, subtle differences you can't quite put your finger on, run. Run fast, run far, and don't look back. Because the thing wearing their face will be right behind you, learning, adapting, perfecting its disguise for the next victim who wanders too deep into its territory. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I still hear my real dog howling somewhere in those mountains, a sound of pure despair that echoes through the darkness, growing fainter each time, as if he's being taken further and further away from any hope of rescue. I should have gone to him that night. I should have tried to save him. But if I had, you'd never have learned about what's waiting out there in the wilderness, patient and hungry, wearing the faces of those we love most. The scratching at the door has started again. My sister is asleep, and I'm too terrified to look through the peephole this time. But I know what I'll see. Amber eyes staring back at me, too intelligent, too calculating, in a face that looks exactly like my beloved Kodiak. The thing has found me. It's finally come home. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Uinta Mountains of northeastern Utah in September of last year, during what was supposed to be a healing trip for Sarah and me. Sarah Rodriguez had been my girlfriend for 3 years, and we'd been struggling. The kind of struggling that makes you question everything, whether you really know the person sleeping next to you, whether love is enough when trust starts eroding like sandstone in a flash flood. We'd been fighting about small things that weren't really small things. My job keeping me away too much, her growing distant, the way we'd started speaking to each other like polite strangers. The camping trip was my idea. "Let's get away from everything," I'd said. "Just us, the mountains, no cell service, no distractions. We can remember why we fell in love." Sarah had agreed, but with that careful smile she'd been wearing lately, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Still, when she pulled her long black hair back and started packing her gear, I felt a flicker of the old excitement. Maybe we could fix this. Maybe the wilderness could strip away all the noise and leave us with something real again. We drove to the Mirror Lake Highway on a Thursday morning in late September. The aspen trees were turning, splashing the mountainsides with gold that trembled in the wind. Sarah pressed her face to the passenger window, and for a moment she looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with, wonder-struck and present. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and I reached over to squeeze her hand. Her fingers were cold, but she squeezed back. We parked at the Provo River trailhead and shouldered our packs. The plan was simple: hike 5 miles into the backcountry, set up camp at a small alpine lake I'd found on the maps, spend 3 nights reconnecting. No agenda, no pressure, just us and the mountains. The first 2 miles were perfect. September in the Uintas is crisp and clear, with that thin mountain air that makes you feel like you could climb forever. We fell into the old rhythm of hiking together, Sarah's quick steps ahead of me, occasionally turning back to point out a bird or an interesting rock formation. We barely talked, but it felt comfortable, like we were remembering how to be together without words. Then my GPS started acting up. At first, I thought it was just the usual mountain interference. The little blue dot that marked our position would stutter and jump, sometimes placing us half a mile from where we actually were. But as we climbed higher, following what should have been a well-marked trail, the readings became increasingly erratic. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Sarah asked, checking her phone. No signal, of course. I pulled out the paper map I'd brought as backup. But something was wrong with it, too. The contour lines seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and I could swear the trail markers had moved. I'd studied this map for weeks before the trip, traced our route with my finger a dozen times. Now it looked like a foreign country. "Michael?" Sarah's voice carried a note of concern I hadn't heard in months. "The sun's getting pretty low." She was right. We'd started hiking at noon, but the light filtering through the pine boughs had that golden quality of late afternoon. I checked my watch, 6:30 p.m. That couldn't be right. It felt like we'd been walking for maybe 2 hours. "Let's just keep going," I said, though unease was starting to coil in my stomach. "The lake should be just over this ridge." But there was no lake over the ridge, just more forest, thick stands of pine and aspen that seemed to close in around us as the light faded. The trail, if it had ever really been a trail, petered out into a maze of deer paths and fallen logs. "We need to make camp," I said finally. The admission felt like defeat. We found a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, their trunks black against the darkening sky. As I set up our tent, Sarah gathered wood for a fire. The familiar routine was soothing, a return to competence after the confusion of the afternoon. But when I tried to light the fire, the flames flickered blue, not the normal blue of a gas flame, but something deeper, stranger, the color of ice under black water. The wood caught and burned, giving off heat, but that eerie blue light made everything look wrong, our faces like corpses, the trees like prison bars. "That's weird," Sarah said, but she didn't sound particularly bothered. If anything, she seemed more relaxed than she'd been in weeks. We ate our simple dinner, freeze-dried pasta that tasted like cardboard, in near silence. The blue flames danced between us, and I found myself staring into them, mesmerized. They made a soft, crackling sound, like whispers just below the threshold of understanding. "I'm going to turn in early," Sarah said around 9 o'clock. She kissed my cheek, her lips cold despite the fire. "This feels good, Michael. Being out here, I think you were right about this trip." I stayed up another hour, feeding the blue flames and listening to the sounds of the forest. Somewhere in the darkness, something was crying, a high, keening sound that could have been wind through the rocks or a child lost in the woods. It raised the hair on my arms, but I told myself it was just wildlife. Elk, maybe, or coyotes. When I finally crawled into the tent, Sarah was already asleep, curled on her side with her back to me. I lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathing and the strange sounds outside. The crying had stopped, but now there seemed to be whispers in the wind, voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I woke to an empty sleeping bag. Gray, pre-dawn light filtered through the tent walls, and Sarah's sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, the fabric pulled back in a neat triangle. Her hiking boots were gone from the tent's vestibule. "Sarah!" I called, scrambling into my clothes. No answer. Outside, the fire had burned down to cold ashes. Normal gray ashes now, no trace of the blue flames from the night before. I called her name again, louder this time, and heard only my own voice echoing off the mountainsides. Our campsite sat in a small clearing maybe 30 yards across, surrounded by dense forest. I circled the perimeter, looking for signs of where she'd gone, but the ground was hard-packed dirt and pine needles that held no footprints, no broken branches, no disturbed undergrowth. It was as if she'd simply vanished. I spent the morning searching, crashing through the forest like a desperate animal, shouting her name until my voice was raw. By noon, I had to admit the horrible truth. I was lost. Not just Sarah, me too. In my panic, I'd wandered far from our campsite, and now I couldn't find it again. The trees all looked the same, towering pine sentinels that watched me with silent indifference. My GPS was completely dead now, not even powering on. The paper map might as well have been blank. I had no idea which direction led back to the trail, or even if there had ever been a trail at all. That's when I heard her voice. "Michael!" Faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere ahead and to my left. "Michael, help me!" Relief flooded through me so powerfully that my knees almost buckled. I crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, branches whipping at my face, my pack snagging on everything. "Sarah, where are you?" "Here, I'm here." I burst into another clearing and saw her standing at the far edge, maybe 50 yards away. She was facing away from me, her long black hair loose around her shoulders. She wore the same clothes as yesterday, jeans and a red fleece jacket, but something about her posture seemed wrong. Too straight, too still. "Sarah. Thank God," I gasped, jogging toward her. I was so worried. "Where have you been?" She turned around and I stopped dead. It was Sarah's face, Sarah's body, Sarah's clothes, but her eyes. Her eyes were completely black. Not the pupil-dilated black of someone in shock, but black like holes punched in paper. And she wasn't blinking. "I got lost," she said, and her voice was perfectly normal, warm and familiar. But those eyes. I woke up early and went to find water. Then I couldn't find my way back. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. This looked like Sarah, sounded like Sarah, but the woman I'd loved for 3 years had warm brown eyes and blinked constantly when she was nervous. This thing hadn't blinked once since turning around. "Are you okay?" I managed to say. "Your eyes. What about them?" She took a step toward me, and I noticed she wasn't making any sound. No rustle of clothing, no crunch of pine needles underfoot. She moved like she was floating. "They're different." She laughed, and it was Sarah's laugh exactly, that slightly snorting giggle that used to make me smile. Now it made my skin crawl. "Don't be silly, I'm fine, just tired." Another step closer, still silent as a ghost. "Let's go back to camp." I can't find it," I admitted. "I got turned around looking for you." "I know where it is." She smiled, and her teeth were too white, too sharp. "Follow me." Every fiber of my being screamed not to follow this thing, but what choice did I have? I was lost in thousands of acres of wilderness with night coming on. And it looked like Sarah. It sounded like Sarah. Maybe I was just rattled, seeing things that weren't there. But as we walked through the forest, I noticed other wrongness. She never looked back to check if I was following. She never stumbled or caught her foot on a root, despite moving through terrain that had me constantly fighting for balance. And she cast no shadow, even when we passed through patches of afternoon sunlight. After maybe an hour of walking, we emerged into a clearing I recognized. Our campsite. The tent was exactly where I'd left it, our gear neatly arranged. It was as if my morning of frantic searching had been a dream. "See?" Sarah said, turning to face me again. Those black eyes reflected no light at all. "I told you I knew the way." That night was the longest of my life. Sarah, or the thing that looked like Sarah, went through all the motions of a normal evening. She helped prepare dinner, chatted about the beautiful scenery, even kissed me goodnight. But she never blinked, not once. And when she smiled, I could see too many teeth, crowded together like broken glass. I lay in the tent, pretending to sleep, listening to her breathing beside me. But the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too deep, like something much larger than a human woman. And occasionally I would hear other sounds mixed in with the breathing. Clicking sounds, like insects. Whispers in that strange language I'd heard in the wind. Around midnight, she stopped breathing entirely. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering so loud I was sure she could hear it. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant crying sound I'd heard the night before. It was closer now, and I realized with sick certainty that it was coming from the woman lying next to me. When I finally risked a glance, she was staring at me with those bottomless black eyes, her mouth slightly open. Her lips didn't move, but the crying sound continued to pour from her throat, a sound no human voice could make. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep until dawn. The next morning, she was normal again. Brown eyes, natural smile, the slight morning hoarseness in her voice that I'd always found endearing. She made coffee on our camp stove and chatted about wanting to explore the area. "Let's hike up to that ridge," she said, pointing to a rocky outcrop maybe a mile away. "The view should be amazing." I wanted to refuse, wanted to insist we pack up and hike out immediately. But in the morning light, with her eyes the right color and her movements naturally human, I began to doubt what I'd seen. Maybe the stress of our relationship, the disorientation of being lost, had made me imagine things. Maybe she really had just been tired and I'd been seeing threats where none existed. We hiked to the ridge, and the view was amazing. Endless mountains stretching to the horizon, peaks capped with early snow. Sarah took photos with her camera, exclaimed over wildflowers, was perfectly normal except for one thing. She never drank water. I offered her my bottle multiple times during the strenuous climb, but she always declined. "I'm fine," she'd say. "Not thirsty." By the time we reached the ridge, I was parched and dizzy from dehydration, but she showed no signs of fatigue at all. That afternoon, while I napped in the tent, I woke to find her standing over me, perfectly motionless, staring down with those black eyes again. The moment I stirred, they flickered back to brown. "Just checking on you," she said sweetly. "You were tossing and turning." But I hadn't been dreaming. I'd been lying perfectly still, watching her through slitted eyelids. She'd been standing there for at least 10 minutes, just staring, occasionally tilting her head like a bird examining prey. That evening, I decided to test her. "Remember our first date?" I asked as we sat by another blue-burning fire. That little Italian place near your apartment? Of course, she said, smiling. Mama Rizzo's. You spilled marinara sauce on your shirt. Wrong. Our first date had been to a Thai restaurant, and she'd been the one to spill. Red curry on her white dress. She'd laughed about it, said it looked like a crime scene. I'd fallen a little in love with her right then, watching her laugh instead of getting upset. That's right, I said carefully. And you ordered the chicken parmesan. My favorite, she agreed. Sarah was vegetarian. Had been since college. She'd never eaten chicken parmesan in her life. I excused myself to use the bathroom, really just to walk into the forest and think. Whatever was sitting by our campfire, wearing Sarah's face and speaking in Sarah's voice, it wasn't her. It had some of her memories, but not all of them, like a photograph with half the image missing. But where was the real Sarah? And what did this thing want? I got my answer that night. I pretended to fall asleep early, but kept one eye barely cracked open, watching. Around midnight, the thing that looked like Sarah sat up in her sleeping bag. In the dim light filtering through the tent walls, I could see her face changing, features shifting and flowing like melted wax, her jaw unhinged like a snake's, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Her fingers elongated into claws that she used to delicately unzip the tent. She slithered outside, and I do mean slithered. Her lower body had become something serpentine, scales catching what little light penetrated the forest canopy. I waited until I couldn't hear her anymore, then crept out of the tent. The fire had burned down to coals, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I could hear something in the distance, a wet, tearing sound accompanied by soft moaning. Following the sound, I crept through the forest until I found her. She was crouched over someone, in a small depression between two fallen logs. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer she'd caught. Then I saw the familiar red fleece jacket. It was Sarah, the real Sarah. She was still alive, but barely. The thing wearing her face had been feeding on her, keeping her alive to prolong the meal. Sarah's eyes rolled toward me, wide with pain and terror and desperate hope. Please, she whispered through lips that barely moved. Please help me. The creature that had been impersonating her looked up from its feeding, Sarah's stolen face smeared with blood. When it saw me, it smiled with too many teeth. Michael, it said in Sarah's voice, you're supposed to be sleeping. I ran. I crashed through the forest like a wild animal, branches whipping at my face, my pack forgotten back at the campsite. Behind me, I could hear it giving chase. Not the sound of human footsteps, but something much worse, like a massive snake sliding across the forest floor. Michael, it called in Sarah's voice, where are you going? Don't leave me. But underneath Sarah's familiar tones, I could hear something else. A hissing, clicking sound like insects or radio static. The sound of something that had never learned to properly mimic human speech. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then kept crawling until I found a narrow crevice between two large boulders. I wedged myself as far back as I could and waited. The thing found me anyway. Michael, Sarah's voice called from just outside my hiding place. I know you're in there. Why are you hiding from me? I pressed myself deeper into the rock, trying not to breathe. I'm hurt, Michael. That thing, it hurt me. Please, I need your help. For a moment, I almost believed it. The voice was perfect. Sarah's voice exactly, down to the slight lisp on the S sounds that she'd always been self-conscious about. But then I remembered the real Sarah, broken and dying in the forest clearing. You're not Sarah, I whispered. Silence for a long moment. Then laughter, not Sarah's warm giggle, but something cold and alien. Smart boy, it said, and now the voice was completely different. Androgynous, ageless, with an accent I couldn't place. But it doesn't matter. She's dying, you know. Your precious Sarah. Every minute you hide in there is another minute of her suffering. What are you? I'm hungry, it said simply. And you taste like love and guilt and delicious, delicious fear. You're Sarah. She tastes like hope turning to despair. Exquisite. Let her go. More laughter. Why would I do that? I haven't had such a fine meal in decades. Usually it's just hikers, campers, people who won't be missed for days. But you two, you love each other. Do you know how much sweeter terror tastes when it's seasoned with love? I heard movement outside, the sound of something large repositioning itself. I can wait, it continued conversationally. I'm very patient. Days, weeks, months if necessary. But your Sarah doesn't have that long. Maybe you could save her if you came out now. Maybe there's still time. It was lying. I knew it was lying, but doubt gnawed at me anyway. What if there was a chance? What if Sarah was still alive out there, counting on me to save her? Tell you what, the thing said. A trade. You come out, let me have my fill of you, and I'll make her death quick. Merciful. She won't suffer anymore. Go to hell. Hell? It laughed again. Oh, little man, I'm much older than your hell. I was feeding in these mountains when your ancestors were still cowering in caves. I'll be here long after your species has forgotten its own name. Hours passed. The thing kept talking, sometimes in Sarah's voice, sometimes in that alien tone, occasionally in voices I didn't recognize. Other victims, I realized with sick certainty. A child's voice begging for its mother. An old man pleading for his medication. A woman screaming for her husband to run. As dawn approached, the voices finally stopped. I waited another hour before crawling out of my hiding place, every muscle cramped and aching. The forest was silent except for normal morning sounds, birds singing, wind in the trees. I crept back toward where I'd seen the real Sarah, dreading what I would find. She was gone. The depression between the logs was empty except for some torn fabric and dark stains on the pine needles. I searched the area frantically but found no other trace of her. I spent 2 more days lost in those mountains, drinking from streams and eating huckleberries, before finally stumbling onto a real trail that led me back to civilization. The ranger station, the police, the search and rescue teams, they all asked the same questions over and over. Where had Sarah gone? Why had I left her alone? What exactly had I seen? I told them we'd been separated during a hike, that I'd searched for days before giving up and hiking out for help. What else could I say? That something had been wearing her face? That it had been feeding on her while she was still alive? They would have locked me up. The search teams found our campsite eventually, but there was no sign of Sarah. No blood, no struggle, no trace that she'd ever been there at all. The official report listed her as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. They stopped searching after 2 weeks. I never went back to the mountains. I couldn't sleep for months without seeing those black eyes, hearing Sarah's voice calling my name in the darkness. I moved to a different city, started therapy, tried to build a new life. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I still hear her voice, calling my name, begging me to come back to save her. And I wonder if that thing is still out there, still wearing her face, still feeding, still waiting for me to return. I know I should leave it alone, let the mountains keep their secrets. But I also know the truth. Sarah might still be alive out there. Broken, transformed, but alive. And if there's even the smallest chance of saving her, or putting her out of her misery, I have to try. I've been planning another trip to the Uinta Mountains. Alone this time. I've got better gear, better maps, and a gun. I pray I'll have the courage to use when the time comes, because I'm going back for her. Real or not, human or monster, Sarah is still out there, and I can't live with myself knowing I left her in that place, even if it costs me everything, even if the thing wearing her face is waiting for exactly that. My name is Michael Williams, and I'm going back to the mountains tomorrow. If you're reading this and I don't return, stay away from the Uinta backcountry. Stay away from blue fires and voices in the darkness. And if you see a woman with black hair and brown eyes who says her name is Sarah Rodriguez, who seems perfectly normal except she never blinks, Run. Just run. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Utah's Uinta Mountains, where the aspens whisper secrets that should never be heard, and the darkness between the trees holds more than shadows. I should have listened to the ranger at the Mirror Lake trailhead who warned me about hiking alone, especially with storm clouds gathering over the peaks, but I was running from something back home, a relationship that had turned toxic, a job that was slowly killing my soul, and I needed the solitude that only the wilderness could provide. Besides, I wasn't truly alone. Max, my German Shepherd mix, padded beside me as we started up the trail toward Lost Lake, his amber eyes alert and ears pricked forward. The first day was perfect. We hiked through stands of towering pines and across meadows carpeted with wildflowers that wouldn't bloom for much longer with autumn approaching. Max chased chipmunks while I breathed in the thin mountain air, feeling my shoulders relax for the first time in months. We made camp beside a small unnamed tarn, the water so clear I could see cutthroat trout darting between the rocks 20 feet down. That evening, as I cooked freeze-dried pasta over my camp stove, a woman emerged from the tree line. She was probably in her early 30s, with long auburn hair and the kind of tan that spoke of serious outdoor time. Her gear looked expensive, but well used. "Mind if I share your fire?" she asked, gesturing to where I'd built a small circle of stones. "I'm Elena, and I promise I'm not a serial killer." I laughed, surprised by how good it felt to hear another human voice. "Sarah. And this is Max." The dog had positioned himself between us, not growling, but watchful. "I haven't seen anyone else on the trail. I came up from the east, through the Naturalist Basin." Elena dropped her pack and began setting up a lightweight tent 20 feet away, close enough for conversation but respectful of space. "Been out here 4 days. There's something magical about this place, don't you think?" We talked as darkness fell, sharing stories about our favorite hikes and the restorative power of solitude. Elena was a freelance photographer, she said, documenting remote wilderness areas for conservation groups. She showed me some shots on her camera, sweeping vistas and intimate details of flora that demonstrated real skill. But as the night deepened, Max grew increasingly restless. He kept staring into the forest, his ears swiveling toward sounds I couldn't hear. When I tried to coax him closer to the fire, he whined and pressed against my legs. "Dogs sense things we don't," Elena said, watching him. "Indigenous peoples believed animals could see spirits." I was about to respond when my headlamp flickered and died. Elena's did the same a second later, plunging us into absolute darkness. The fire seemed to dim as well, the flames taking on an odd blue tint that cast everything in sickly shadows. "That's weird," I muttered, shaking my light. Fresh batteries, and I'd checked it that morning. "Do you have a spare?" Elena didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice sounded strange, distant. "The darkness here is different. Older." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Max pressed harder against my leg and I could feel him trembling. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. "Elena?" I called softly. No response. I fumbled for my backup flashlight, my hand shaking as I searched my pack. When I finally got it working and swept the beam toward where she'd been sitting, her camping chair was empty. "Elena!" I called louder, standing so quickly that Max barked in alarm. The sound echoed off the peaks and faded into nothing. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling her name and listening for responses that never came. Max followed reluctantly, staying close to my heels and whimpering whenever we moved too far from the fire. Her tent was still there, her pack, her camera equipment, everything except Elena herself. Finally, exhaustion and growing fear drove me back to my sleeping bag. I lay awake for hours, every snap of a twig or rustle in the undergrowth making my heart race. Max curled up, pressed against my side, his body tense and alert. I must have dozed, because I woke to the sound of someone humming. The tune was familiar, a lullaby my grandmother used to sing, but the voice was wrong. Too high, too sweet, with an odd echo as if it came from the bottom of a well. Max was standing now, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Elena," I whispered, unzipping my sleeping bag as quietly as possible. The humming stopped. I reached for my flashlight with trembling fingers, but when I pressed the button, nothing happened. Dead again. The backup light was also mysteriously drained. In the dying glow of the embers, I could make out a figure sitting in Elena's chair. "You're back," I said, relief flooding through me despite the strangeness of the situation. "I was worried sick. Where did you go?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It just sat there, perfectly still, facing toward me, but somehow not quite right. The proportions were off. The head tilted at an angle that would have been uncomfortable for any living person. "Elena!" Max's growl deepened and he took a step backward, pressing against my legs. That's when I noticed the smell, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water, like something rotting underneath. "I found something wonderful," the figure said, and it was Elena's voice, but wrong, flattened somehow without the warmth and animation it had held earlier. "Deep in the forest. It showed me such beautiful things." I fumbled for more wood to build up the fire, needing light, needing to see properly. As the flames caught and flared, illuminating our campsite, I bit back a scream. It was Elena, or something wearing her face, but her skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and her eyes were completely black, no iris or pupil visible, just endless dark that seemed to pull at me. When she smiled, I could see that her teeth had grown longer, sharper. "The darkness wants to show you too," she said, standing with movements that were too fluid, too graceful. "It's been waiting so long for visitors." Max launched himself forward with a snarl, but the thing that looked like Elena moved impossibly fast, catching him mid-leap and hurling him against a tree with inhuman strength. He hit with a sickening thud and fell still. "Max!" I screamed, running toward my dog, but Elena, or whatever she had become, grabbed my wrist with fingers that felt like ice and steel. "He can't come where we're going," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "But don't worry, he'll join us soon enough." I drove my knee into her stomach and twisted away, my wilderness training finally kicking in. She doubled over with a sound like wind through dead leaves, and I ran toward Max. He was breathing, but unconscious, blood trickling from his muzzle. Behind me, Elena laughed, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to come from the forest itself rather than her throat. "You can't run from what you've already invited in, Sarah. We've been sharing your fire, breathing your air. We're part of you now." I scooped up my pack and as much gear as I could carry, then gently lifted Max. He was heavy, but adrenaline made him feel weightless. I stumbled away from the campsite into the forest, using the moonlight to navigate between the trees. For hours, I pushed through the darkness, Max draped across my shoulders, stopping only when my legs gave out completely. When I finally collapsed beside a fallen log, I was miles from the lake, deep in uncharted wilderness. Max stirred and lifted his head, whimpering softly. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, running my hands over his body to check for serious injuries. He seemed battered, but not broken. "We have to keep moving." That's when I heard it, the same terrible humming, drifting through the trees from multiple directions. Not just Elena's voice now, but others, creating a discordant harmony that made my teeth ache. I pulled out my GPS unit, hands shaking as I tried to get a reading. The screen flickered and showed our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. When I switched to my backup compass, the needle spun wildly before pointing in a direction that should have been impossible given the position of the stars. The humming grew closer. Max struggled to his feet, and together we pressed deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around us, branches catching at my clothing and hair like grasping fingers. Every shadow held the suggestion of movement. Every rustle of leaves sounded like whispered words in languages I didn't recognize. Dawn should have come hours ago, but the darkness held with unnatural persistence. When I checked my watch, the hands were spinning backward. We emerged into a small clearing dominated by a circle of standing stones that shouldn't have existed in this part of Utah. They were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they were carved not just into the rock, but into reality itself. In the center of the circle, Elena waited. But she wasn't alone. There were others now, men and women in various stages of decay and transformation. Some looked recently dead, their clothing still recognizable as modern hiking gear. Others appeared ancient, their flesh mummified and clinging to bones in tatters. All of them had those same black eyes that reflected no light. "Welcome home," Elena said, her voice now joined by the chorus of the others. "We've been preparing your place in the circle." Max pressed against my leg, no longer growling but whimpering in terror. I understood how he felt. Looking at the assembled figures, I realized they had all been like me once. Hikers, campers, people seeking solitude in the wilderness who had found something that had been waiting for them. "What do you want?" I asked, surprised that my voice didn't shake. "To grow," Elena said simply. "To add your voice to ours. To show you the beautiful things that live in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between thoughts." One of the older figures stepped forward, its movements accompanied by the sound of rustling leaves though there was no wind. When it spoke, I recognized the voice from my dreams, the one that had been calling my name in the dark places of my childhood. "You've always belonged to us, Sarah. Every nightmare, every moment you feared the dark, you were hearing our song." The circle began to close around us, moving with that same unnatural fluid grace. Max pressed harder against my leg and I could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. My own pulse thundered in my ears as I looked for an escape route and found none. That's when I remembered the emergency flare in my pack. I yanked it free and pulled the tab, filling the clearing with brilliant red light. The assembled figures shrieked and recoiled, their forms seeming to waver and become less solid in the harsh illumination. Elena's beautiful face twisted into something predatory and terrible. "Run, Max!" I shouted, and my dog needed no encouragement. We burst through the gap in their circle and back into the forest, the flare held high above my head like a torch. Behind us, the screaming continued, but it was changing, becoming less human and more like the sound wind makes through empty caves. I don't know how long we ran. The flare burned out after 15 minutes, but somehow the forest had grown lighter, as if the unnatural darkness was finally beginning to lift. When we finally stopped, gasping and exhausted, I could see the first genuine rays of dawn filtering through the canopy. My GPS still showed us in the middle of the ocean, but I followed the rising sun east, carrying Max when he stumbled and letting him carry me when my own strength failed. We found a ranger station just after noon, a building that my map insisted didn't exist. The ranger who answered my frantic pounding on the door took one look at us and immediately called for medical attention. While we waited for the helicopter, he told me something that made my blood run cold. "You're the first people to come out of that area in 3 years," he said. "We stopped issuing permits after the disappearances. Folks would go in and never come back out. Search and rescue couldn't even find the bodies." I wanted to tell him about Elena, about the circle of stones and the things that had once been human. But how do you explain that the wilderness sometimes hungers for more than just deer and rabbits? How do you make someone understand that there are places where the darkness is thick enough to touch, old enough to remember things that happened before humans ever walked upright? The helicopter took us to a hospital in Salt Lake City, where doctors treated Max for a concussion and me for exhaustion and exposure. They asked gentle questions about my hallucinations and prescribed sleeping pills that I never took. The police filled out reports about Elena's disappearance, but I could see in their eyes that they thought I'd imagined her entirely. Maybe I did. Maybe the stress of my life back home, combined with altitude and isolation, created an elaborate delusion. Maybe I got lost and hit my head, and everything else was just my brain trying to make sense of fragmented memories. But I know what I saw. I know what touched me in that clearing. And I know that Elena is still out there, waiting in the darkness between the trees, adding her voice to a chorus that grows larger every year. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I can still hear them humming. Max recovered completely, though he refuses to go near any forested areas now. He's gotten old and gray in the 5 years since our trip, but his hearing is still sharp. Sometimes he'll stop in the middle of our walks around the neighborhood and stare at shadows with that same terrified intensity he showed in the mountains. His hackles rise, and he whines deep in his throat, and I know he's remembering too. The thing that haunts me most isn't the fear or the violence or even the near-death experience. It's the memory of Elena's voice before she changed, the genuine warmth and friendship I felt during those few hours by the fire. I keep wondering if she was real, if somewhere in that twisted thing with the black eyes was a woman who had also been seeking solitude and found something else entirely. I keep wondering if, given enough time, I would have made the same choices she did. I've moved to Phoenix now, far from any serious wilderness. I work in an office building with fluorescent lights that never go out, and I live in an apartment complex where the nearest trees are ornamental palms. I tell myself I'm safe here, surrounded by concrete and civilization. But sometimes, when the lights flicker during a storm or when I catch my reflection in a dark window, I see something in my own eyes that wasn't there before. Something that reflects the wrong kind of light. And I remember Elena's words about breathing the same air, sharing the same fire. I remember her saying that we had invited them in. The darkness followed us home, you see? It always does. It just takes time to find the right moment to make itself known. Max knows it too. That's why he watches the shadows so carefully, why he positions himself between me and the dark corners of our apartment. He's waiting for them to reach out of the spaces between seconds, between thoughts, between the moments when we think we're safe. But the truly terrifying thing is that part of me is waiting too. Part of me remembers the beautiful things Elena promised to show me, the songs that echo in the pause between heartbeats. Part of me wonders what would have happened if I had stayed in that circle, if I had let the darkness embrace me completely. That part of me grows a little stronger every day. Last week, I caught myself humming a tune I didn't recognize while doing dishes. The melody was sweet and familiar, like a lullaby my grandmother might have sung. When I realized what I was doing, I stopped so abruptly that I dropped a glass and cut my hand on the shards. The blood looked black in the kitchen light. Max sat by my feet while I bandaged the wound, and when I looked into his amber eyes, I saw my own fear reflected back at me. We both know what's coming. We both know it's only a matter of time. The wilderness never really lets go of what it claims. It just waits patiently for you to stop running, to stop fighting, to finally accept the invitation you didn't know you'd accepted. I think about Elena often now, about the choice she made in those woods. I wonder if she fought it at first, if she tried to resist the beautiful, terrible things calling to her from the darkness. I wonder if, in the end, she decided that joining them was better than spending the rest of her life running from them. Tonight, I dreamed about the circle of stones again. In the dream, there was a space waiting for me, and Elena stood beside it with that familiar warm smile she'd worn by our campfire. Her eyes were brown again, human again, and she looked exactly as she had before the darkness claimed her. "It's time to come home," she said in the dream, and her voice was full of love and understanding. "You've been alone long enough." When I woke up, Max was standing by the bedroom door, every muscle in his body tense with alertness. He was staring at something in the hallway that I couldn't see, his lips pulled back in a silent snarl. I didn't turn on the lights to look. I already know what's waiting out there in the dark. The beautiful, terrible things are patient. They can wait as long as it takes. And honestly, I'm getting tired of running.